Long ago, when giants ruled and the skies watched in silence, their rebellion shattered the balance between heaven and earth. Now, as the waters withdraw and the ground remembers, humanity stands at the edge of an ancient warning. Will we listen or fall again? In the beginning, before time stretched its first tendrils into the void, there was only the infinite expanse of the unformed cosmos. A vast, undivided potential waited, silent, formless, yet filled with a divine purpose that transcended the nothingness it inhabited. The Creator, in all its unnameable magnificence, gazed upon the void and saw not an empty space, but a canvas awaiting the brush of order. With a word, light split the darkness, and the heavens and the earth were born from the swirling depths. The great design began. In the divine stillness, the Creator breathed life into the cosmos, shaping the stars, the planets, and the delicate balance that would hold the universe together. The sun blazed with new fire, the moon was set in its eternal orbit, and the waters separated from the land in a perfect symmetry. All of creation moved to a rhythm, a celestial dance that echoed the Creator's intentions, harmony, balance, and beauty. But the order was not yet complete. Creation needed stewards, watchers, keepers of its delicate balance. From the brilliance of the Creator's will, the watchers came into being. Mighty beings of light, they were woven from the fabric of the heavens themselves. Their forms were not bound by earthly flesh, but by pure celestial essence. Their eyes, like pools of starlight, could pierce the veil of time and see the unfolding of destiny. It was their charge to observe, to protect the unfolding of creation as it rippled across the vast expanse of the earth. They were the first beings to witness the stirrings of humanity, fragile creatures made from dust, yet given the spark of life by the very hand of the Creator. Tasked with observing humanity, the watchers were not to interfere, but to guide from afar, keeping the natural order intact. They saw the rise of civilizations, the growth of knowledge, the development of human hearts and minds. But within their role, they also harbored the divine charge of ensuring that creation unfolded according to the divine design. Their gaze was never passive, always careful, always deliberate. To touch the earth was forbidden. To intervene was not their place. They were the eternal witnesses, watching as human hands shaped the world and as their hearts both struggled and soared. The watchers were silent in their vigilance. Each day another step in the ever-expanding story of the cosmos. As the ages passed, the watchers grew ever more familiar with the pulse of the earth, drawn by the intricacies of human life. And in the quiet folds of their hearts, they began to wonder, could their role be more than just watching? Could the line between the divine and the earthly blur? It was in that moment of wondering that the seeds of their fall were sown. What had begun as pure observation would soon, through the frailty of their desire, become something far darker. But that, too, was part of the plan, part of the great design. The watchers, though intended to be observers, would become something far more than that. The stillness of the heavens had always been a quiet comfort for the watchers. From their positions high above, they observed the world below humanity unfolding, growing, struggling, and thriving, but never touching the earth. For eons, they were content in their place, bound by the laws set before them. They watched as civilizations rose and fell, as hearts broke and healed, yet they never intervened. They were meant to be passive witnesses to the story of mankind, holding the balance of creation with unspoken reverence. But slowly, that quietude began to stir. Shemihaza, their leader, felt it first. The stirring, a yearning for something more, something deeper than mere observation. He saw the beauty of humanity's progress, the potential within them, and the allure of their desires. There was a fascination in their fragility, in their imperfection. They were, in many ways, more vibrant than the perfection of the celestial realm. And so, Shemihaza, in his quiet contemplation, began to entertain an idea. He gathered his fellow watchers, beings of light and power, and shared with them a visiona, forbidden vision, a vision that would change everything. It was not enough to watch anymore. They were drawn to the earth, to its warmth, to its passions. They had witnessed human love, sorrow, joy, and pain, and they found themselves longing for those experiences themselves. "Let us descend," Shemihaza proposed, his voice carrying the weight of eternity. "Let us join with them." The words echoed through the hearts of the watchers, like a spark to dry tinder. It was an idea that none could dismiss, though none could fully understand the depths of its consequences. And so, in secret, they swore an oath to descend from their divine heights and take human wives, to impart upon them knowledge that was never meant to be shared. The oath was binding, a promise forged in their collective desire, a promise that would echo through the corridors of time. They would defy the Creator's command, blur the lines between the celestial and the mortal, and give humanity the secrets of the heavens. Knowledge of war, of astrology, of forbidden artsal would be passed to the children of earth. In that moment, the watchers chose to fall, to step into a realm where divine light would no longer touch them. The humans saw them as gods. They marveled at their descent, at their strange, radiant beauty. But there was something else. Fear, too, bloomed in their hearts. The giants they fathered were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Their size was a mystery, their power both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Yet the humans, in their reverence, offered no resistance. They worshipped these beings, those who bore the knowledge of the heavens, while unwittingly stepping into a pact that would change the world forever. The Watchers, with their new flesh, were no longer just observers. They were now participants in the human drama, bound by their own choices. The fall had begun. The union between the Watchers and the human women brought forth a new breed, beings of immense size and unimaginable power. These children, known as the Nephilim, were born not of Earth's soil but of something darker, something that straddled the line between divinity and mortality. The Nephilim grew quickly, their bodies expanding beyond human proportions, their strength surpassing anything that nature had intended. Towering above their human counterparts, they were giants both literal and metaphorical, embodying the unnatural union between the celestial and the earthly. At first, the humans were in awe of the Nephilim. They saw the giants as living gods, creatures whose very existence seemed to transcend the boundaries of the natural world. They marveled at their strength, their size, their abilities that defied logic. The giants could uproot trees with a single hand, move mountains with a shift of their bodies. They were not bound by the same laws of nature that constrained mere mortals. In the eyes of humanity, the Nephilim were both terrifying and magnificent, an object of reverence, almost divine. But as the Nephilim grew in number and power, their presence began to cast a shadow over the earth. The once peaceful world, untouched by such disruptive force, now trembled beneath the weight of their colossal figures. The giants, driven by a hunger for power, began to consume resources at an alarming rate. Forests fell before them as they hunted the land, and rivers ran dry as they drank. They feasted, not out of necessity, but out of a primal instinct to assert dominance. The balance of nature, once so carefully maintained, began to unravel. At first, the humans tried to coexist with the giants. They offered them food, shelter, and worshipped them in hopes of appeasing their mighty offspring. But the giants' appetite for power was insatiable. What had once been reverence began to shift into fear. The very beings who had once been adored now became the source of terror. The giants, in their unchecked strength, grew careless. They trampled villages underfoot, crushing homes and destroying crops with each step. The lands that were once fertile and lush now lay barren, scorched by their presence. As the giants' wrath spread across the earth, a discontent began to brew among humans. No longer were they in awe of these beings. Instead, they began to fear them, to resent the destruction they caused. The same gods they had once worshipped now terrorized them. Some whispered in the dark of the corruption that had birthed the Nephilim, of the unnatural union between the Watchers and the daughters of man. They questioned the motives behind the giants' creation, and with each passing day, The bond between humans and their celestial progenitors grew ever more tenuous. What had begun as an act of awe had turned into a nightmare. The Nephilim's very existence had disrupted the harmony of the world. The earth, once vibrant with life, now seemed a place of decay, overrun by beings who were too powerful, too flawed to ever be fully embraced. The giants, in all their glory, had brought not peace, but a deep, unshakable discord. The Watchers, in their disobedience, did not merely descend to earth to observe, they came to shape it. With their arrival came knowledge and offering of wisdom that should have remained locked within the heavens. Under the guidance of the fallen angels, humanity was introduced to secrets long forbidden: the forging of metal, the study of the stars, the casting of spells, and countless other arts that were never meant to touch mortal hands. At first, the teachings seemed like blessings, tools that would elevate humanity from its primal state. Azazel, one of the leaders among the Watchers, taught the art of metalworking, how to mine the deep veins of the earth, smelt its ores, and shape them into weapons, tools, and ornaments. The metal gleamed like a mirror to the heavens, a reflection of divine power, yet it soon became a tool of destruction. Where once humans had lived with what the earth provided, they now began to carve and shape the world according to their own desires. What had been a gentle relationship with nature became an insatiable lust for resources, and with it, violence. Kokoel, another of the Watchers, revealed the mysteries of astrology, the art of reading the stars. What was once a guide to the heavens became a chart for control, a means of bending the natural world to human will. Humans began to look not to the earth beneath them, but to the stars above for guidance. They read meaning into the motions of distant planets and constellations, believing their fates were written in the skies. The stars, which had once been admired for their beauty and their connection to the divine, became a means of superstition, a crutch for human desire to predict and control what was beyond their reach. They saw themselves as masters of fate, even as they neglected the consequences of their arrogance. Other Watchers, such as Baracel, taught the secrets of the natural world, how to understand the power of plants, how to coax the earth's hidden properties into revealing themselves. Shamjaza, the leader of the Watchers, taught the practice of magic, how to bend the spiritual world to one's will, to call upon unseen forces, and to manipulate them. It was knowledge, yes, but knowledge without wisdom. It was power given without the responsibility to wield it. What was once sacred, the knowledge of the earth and its spirits, became a weapon for manipulation and control. As these teachings spread, the balance of the world began to shift. Humanity, once at peace with the earth, now sought to dominate it. The tools of metal, the signs of the stars, the spells of magical became the instruments of corruption. What had been a flourishing of knowledge became a spreading darkness, a path away from harmony and into chaos. The natural order was disrupted, not by the giants, but by the very wisdom the Watchers had bestowed upon humanity. They had lifted the veil between the divine and mortal realms, but in doing so, they had allowed humanity to peek into worlds it was not prepared to understand, much less control. In the wake of these teachings, humanity began to fracture. What was once a simple life, connected to the cycles of nature, now became a life of conquest and manipulation. The consequences of the Watchers' gifts were not immediately felt, but they festered beneath the surface, turning what was once sacred into something twisted. And as humanity stretched beyond its limits, it drew closer to the precipice of its undoing. The giants, born of forbidden unions, inherited more than just their immense size and power. They carried within them the knowledge of their celestial fathers, the Watchers, who had once been tasked with observing the natural order of the world. But now, those celestial duties twisted into a darker purpose. The giants, in their arrogance and curiosity, began to experiment with the very fabric of creation. What once flowed naturally from the earth now became a canvas for their distortions. They sought to manipulate nature, to bend it to their will in ways that should have been impossible. The first of their experiments involved animals, beasts of the wild. creatures who roamed free in the forests and plains. The giants, driven by their inherited wisdom, began crossbreeding species. They forced animals to mate across boundaries, mixing the blood of lion and goat, of wolf and eagle. These unnatural unions gave birth to monstrous hybrid beasts, stronger, faster, and more savage than anything nature had ever intended. They tore through ecosystems with the ferocity of their unnatural strength, hunting for sport, destroying entire species to satisfy their insatiable hunger for dominance. But it was not only the animals that suffered under the giants' hands. The very plants of the earth felt the upheaval. The giants, in their desire to shape the world in their image, began to tamper with the growth of plants. They grafted toxic species onto nourishing ones, creating fruits that looked ripe for the picking but were filled with poison. They cultivated plants that grew unnaturally fast, their roots tearing through the earth, cracking the very foundations of the land. These new breeds of flora spread like a plague, crowding out native plants, choking the life from the natural order. What had once been a thriving and balanced landscape now resembled a field of chaos, where the earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of these unnatural creations. The giants, though powerful, were blind to the consequences of their actions. In their pursuit of control, they had failed to see that nature was not theirs to command. The order of life, from the smallest seed to the greatest mountain, had been designed to exist in harmony. But the giants, with their celestial knowledge, had ignored that balance. They had sought to shape creation, to impose their will upon it, without understanding the consequences of such tampering. And in doing so, they began to unravel the very fabric of the world they had been born to protect. As their creations multiplied, so did the signs of imbalance. The sky grew darker, and the earth groaned beneath the weight of the giants' interventions. The rivers, once clear and pure, ran thick with the blood of the hybrid beasts. Forests fell silent, the songs of birds replaced by the heavy silence of unnatural predators. The giants had crossed a line, and naturance, a harmonious expression of divine will, began to rebel against them. The world, once filled with the rhythms of life, now trembled at the chaos they had unleashed. The rebellion, once a quiet stirring among the watchers, grew louder as the consequences of their actions became undeniable. In the beginning, their descent had been filled with purpose. They had sought to impart wisdom to humanity, to gift them with knowledge that would accelerate their progress. But over time, the lines between guidance and control blurred. Now, as the earth beneath them began to tremble and the heavens grew heavy with the weight of their defiance, some of the watchers could no longer ignore the ruin they had helped unleash. For a few, the shift was slow but inevitable. The enormity of their transgression weighed heavily on their hearts. They began to question the righteousness of their path. Had their intentions been pure, or had they too been seduced by the allure of earthly pleasures? They had violated the divine boundaries set by the Creator, and in the quiet of their celestial prison, some of them felt the first stirrings of remorse. They saw the chaos spreading across the earth, the corruption they had fostered in the form of hybrid creatures, and humanity's rapid descent into violence and greed. What had they done? They had not helped humanity ascend. They had pushed them into the chasm of disorder. But remorse was a fleeting guest among the fallen. For every watcher who questioned their actions, there were many more who remained steadfast in their defiance. Shemihaza, their leader, felt no regret for the choices they had made. His pride, once a beacon of celestial authority, now burned with the fire of rebellion. To him, their actions were justified. Humans were better for the knowledge they had received, and the watchers had the right to shape the world as they saw fit. The divine boundaries, in his eyes, were chains that kept the cosmos stagnant. It was only through their rebellion that humanity would truly flourish. This defiance spread like a disease through the ranks of the watchers. While a few angels turned inward, lamenting their fall from grace, the majority rallied behind Shemihaza's unrepentant resolve. They reveled in the freedom they had claimed, seeing their actions not as betrayal but as liberation. They were not bound by divine will. They were the masters of their own fate, and humanity too, would learn to follow their lead. The rebellion no longer remained confined to the Watchers. The imbalance they had sown in the natural world spread like a fever, infecting everything it touched. The very earth groaned under the strain of the heavenly revolt. Where once the rhythm of creation had danced in harmony, now there was only discord, the harmony of life shattered by the echoes of rebellion. The Watchers, in their arrogance, had thought they could defy divine order without consequence, but with every moment of their defiance, the world itself was pulled deeper into chaos. It was a slow unraveling, but one that could not be ignored, and as the earth began to buckle under the weight of their sin, the time for reckoning grew ever closer. As the giants' power swelled, so did their pride. The unnatural offspring of celestial beings and human women, they had grown larger, stronger, and more forceful with each passing day. What had begun as a gift-a union between divine Watchers and mortal women had soured into something darker. The giants, now towering over humanity, no longer saw the people as equals, but as ants beneath their heels, insignificant and weak. Their arrogance fueled a growing sense of entitlement. No longer satisfied with simply existing, they demanded more land, more resources, more tribute. In their wake, entire villages were obliterated, trampled beneath the weight of their feet. Fields once fertile were left barren, the fruits of the earth consumed in mere moments, their appetites insatiable. The giants' indulgence in their strength had twisted them into creatures of pure violence. What had started as isolated outbursts soon escalated into a relentless campaign of destruction. They would take whatever they desired, leaving no trace of the villages they had ransacked, no memory of the families they had destroyed. Humanity, powerless in the face of such might, could do little but flee or hide. At first, the humans had resisted, fighting back in desperate acts of defiance. But each time the giants returned, they were met with greater force. The sight of towering figures striding across the earth, their power unquestionable, filled the hearts of men with terror. Where once there was unity in human communities, now there was only fear and suspicion. People turned against one another, fighting not just for survival, but for dominance, believing that in the chaos of the giants' reign, power was the only thing that mattered. The land itself began to suffer, as the delicate balance of life was shattered by the giants' greed. The once pristine rivers ran thick with the waste of their unrestrained hunger. The air grew heavy with the stench of destruction, as trees were uprooted and mountains carved away for the sake of indulgence. Nothing was sacred. No place was untouched by their rampage. The giants, in their cruel arrogance, had crossed the line between might and tyranny, and their rule became a poison that seeped into the very bones of the world. Humanity, now living in a constant state of terror, began to lose hope. The giants had not only taken their homes, their food, and their peace, they had taken their spirit. And with each passing day, as the earth trembled under the weight of their violence, a realization began to settle over the people. This was no longer a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future of the world itself. The giants, unchecked in their power and blind to the damage they had caused, had pushed the earth to a point of no return. The winds of fate, once calm, now began to howl with the coming storm. The world that had known peace for so long was on the brink of collapse. As the giants' influence continued to spread, the world itself began to reflect the disruption they had caused. What was once a harmonious balance of nature now withered under their hands. The earth groaned, as ecosystems that had existed in delicate equilibrium began to crumble. The giants' reckless manipulation of life, their crossbreeding of animals, the unnatural growth of plants corrupted the very fabric of creation. Entire species, once thriving, disappeared into the void, while others mutated beyond recognition. The food chain, once a fine-tuned system of predator and prey, faltered, and the balance that had taken millennia to perfect teetered on the edge of ruin. The giants, in their arrogant pursuit of power and indulgence, failed to understand the consequences of their actions. They viewed nature not as something to coexist with, but as a tool to bend to their will. They reshaped it, tore it apart, and in doing so, destroyed the very foundation of life itself. The skies grew darker, the rivers tainted with unnatural substances, and the earth itself began to die under the strain of their experiments. Forests, once dense with life, stood bare, their trees twisted and malformed. The rivers, once clear and pure, now ran thick with the byproducts of the giants' tampering. As the natural world began to unravel, a quiet sense of decay seeped into the heavens. The celestial bodies, once shining with divine harmony, dimmed, as if even the stars themselves recoiled from the disorder unfolding below. The Watchers, those celestial beings who had once observed humanity with purpose, now found themselves struggling with the enormity of their rebellion. They had crossed the line that separated the divine from the mortal, and in doing so, had shattered the order they had been tasked with upholding. In their arrogance, they had twisted the very essence of creation, and the cosmic consequence of their actions now loomed large. The heavens, once a realm of pristine beauty and divine purpose, seemed to pulse with an unease that echoed through the fabric of reality itself. The Watchers, despite their defiance, could feel it, the slow, inevitable collapse of the order they had once stood for. And yet, even as the weight of their betrayal pressed down upon them, most remained indifferent. Shemihaza, their leader, still clung to his belief that their rebellion was justified, that the consequences were mere ripples in the vast ocean of the cosmos. But the truth was undeniable. Creation was unraveling, and with each passing day, the fabric of the world grew weaker, the ancient order of things fraying at the edges. The giants had not only defiled the earth, they had stained the heavens, and now the heavens began to mourn. In the midst of the chaos that the giants had wrought, whispers began to rise from the ancient prophets and seers, voices long ignored but now impossible to silence. Among them, Enoch stood as the most vivid, his words cutting through the storm of arrogance and corruption that had overtaken the earth. His visions, granted through his deep communion with the divine, painted a terrifying future where the sins of both humanity and the giants would culminate in a reckoning beyond comprehension. The prophecy he shared spoke of a great deluge, a flood so vast it would drown all but the smallest remnant of life. It was a message that stirred both fear and disbelief among those who still remembered the old ways, the ways of harmony with the earth. Enoch's prophecy, unlike the hollow promises of the giants, was clear. The flood would come not as a natural disaster, but as a divine judgmental cleansing of creation itself. The waters would rise and wash away the corruption that had tainted the land, the seas, the very air. In the heavens, the celestial order had already begun to realign itself, and the Creator's will could no longer be ignored. The giants, with their boundless power and arrogance, had crossed too many lines. Humanity, too, had turned a blind eye to the destruction unfolding around them, lulled into complacency by the giants' dominance. But what struck the most profound fear into the hearts of those who heard Enoch's warnings was not just the deluge itself, but the reason behind it. The flood was not just a punishment, but a necessary purification, a restoration of balance that had been lost to the giants' experiments and the human disregard for natural order. It was a divine mercy, as much as it was a judgment. The earth, like a body sickened by disease, would be cleansed, but not without great pain. Only after the cleansing waters had receded would there be the possibility of rebirth, a fragile chance to begin again, to rebuild from the fragments that would survive. Yet, humanity was unprepared. The world had long turned its gaze away from the heavens, too caught up in the here and now to heed the ancient warnings. The giants, with their towering presence and irresistible power, had come to dominate both land and spirit. Humanity, caught in their wake, had lost the capacity to see beyond the moment, to understand the cosmic significance of what was unfolding. Even the wise, those who had once known the old ways, could no longer grasp the enormity of what was to come. Enoch's warnings were met with skepticism, and many still refused to believe that a flood, something so extraordinary, so unimaginable could truly wash away the ruinous path they had set the world upon. But the heavens had already spoken, and the flood, though unseen, was drawing closer, ever more inevitable. The earth itself was trembling, preparing to fulfill the ancient prophecy, and all who remained unready would be caught in its merciless tide. As the world continued to spiral deeper into chaos, a small group of humans, untouched by the greed and violence that had overtaken their world, found themselves awakening to a sense of duty. Led by a prophetic figure, a man whose heart was aligned with the will of the divine, these righteous souls became a quiet beacon in the darkness. They saw the devastation that had been wrought by the giants and the watchers, the unnatural distortions of life that were spreading across the land like a contagion. Their hearts ached not only for their own suffering, but for the suffering of the earth itself, which seemed to cry out in its own agony. They could no longer stand idly by, watching as the giants trampled the world beneath their feet. On a night marked by silence and grief, far from the wreckage of villages and the ruins of civilizations, these humans gathered. They prayed, not for their own safety, not for comfort, but for justice, for a reckoning to rise and end the monstrous reign of the giants. Their voices reached upward, a chorus of desperation and determination. Their words carried on the winds of hope. They called out to the heavens, their hearts pierced by the weight of the world's suffering. "How long must we endure?" they cried. "When will justice come? When will the earth be free from the destruction of the giants?" The prayers of these righteous few did not go unheard. In the very halls of heaven, where the divine court held dominion, the cries of the suffering reached the ears of the Creator. The celestial beings, who had long been silent observers of the earth's decay, stirred with a sense of urgency. For ages, the Watchers and their monstrous children had wreaked havoc with impunity. But now, with the prayer of the righteous rising like smoke, something shifted. The divine court, once distant, began to turn its gaze downward. The time had come. Heaven had watched, waiting for the right moment. The moment when the suffering of creation could no longer be ignored. Now, that moment had arrived. The divine decision was clear. The giants would be judged, and their reign would come to an end. This was no longer a matter of patience or mercy. It was the time for action. The balance of creation had been shattered, and it was up to the divine will to restore it. The giants' corruption, their monstrous offspring, and their disruption of the natural order had pushed the world to a breaking point. Heaven would not allow the earth to suffer under the weight of their sins any longer. The judgment, however, was not swift. It was measured, deliberate, and exacting. The flood was but the beginning, a cleansing act that would purge the world of the stain the giants had left behind. Yet this was not only about retribution. It was about restoring the divine order, about healing what had been broken and giving humanity the chance to begin anew, free from the chains the giants had placed on the world. Heaven had answered the call for justice, and now the wheels of divine retribution were set into motion. In the heart of the celestial realms, where time was but a fleeting whisper and light itself shimmered with divine intent, the archangels convened. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, each a pillar of heaven's might and wisdom, gathered in the grand halls of the heavenly court. The weight of the moment hung in the air, as the fate of the Watchers and their monstrous progeny was now in their hands. The universe, stretched across infinite dimensions, held its breath in anticipation. The court had been convened, not in anger or wrath, but in solemn deliberation. The charges against the Watchers were grave, their sins so profound that even the heavens could not ignore the corruption they had sown. Michael, the warrior archangel, stepped forward, his presence like the calm before a storm. He spoke with authority, his voice ringing with the weight of truth. The Watchers had not merely disobeyed their sacred mandate, but had broken the very fabric of creation. Their actions had unleashed a tide of violence, greed, and chaos upon the earth. They had crossed the boundary between the divine and the earthly, defiled the natural order, and given birth to horrors in the form of giants beings that should never have existed. Their descent had not been a mere act of rebellion but a betrayal of their purpose, a corruption of the divine light they had once been entrusted to uphold. Gabriel, ever the messenger of divine will, nodded gravely. He spoke of the suffering that had erupted from the Watchers' transgressions. The earth, once full of harmony and balance, had become a place of endless violence, where the giants' unchecked power had shattered cities, devoured resources, and twisted life itself. He reminded the council that the Watchers had not acted in ignorance, but in full knowledge of their sin. Their choices had not been born of misjudgment but from an overwhelming lust for power, knowledge, and earthly pleasures. Raphael, the healer, stood in silence for a moment, his gaze soft yet resolute. He spoke of the deep wounds the earth had suffered, the scars left by the giant's reign of terror. Yet, even in his sorrow, he understood that there could be no true healing without the proper reckoning. The Watchers had not just violated the divine order, they had become instruments of decay. Their very existence now threatened the cosmic harmony, and their continued presence was a poison too potent to be allowed to remain. Lastly, Uriel, keeper of wisdom, raised his voice. His words were simple yet profound. "They have defiled the sanctity of creation," he said. "They have broken the trust placed upon them. There can be no more delay. Their punishment must be swift, and their progeny erased." The decision was unanimous. The Watchers would be bound, chained in a prison between worlds where they could neither harm nor influence the earth. Their progeny, the giants, would face destruction. Heaven's justice had spoken, and the scales of divine balance would be restored, even at the cost of profound sorrow. The wheels of judgment had begun to turn, and there would be no turning back. The flood was now imminent. The heavens trembled as the archangels, sent forth with the weight of divine will, descended upon the earth. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel moved as one, their forms cloaked in the unyielding light of justice. They did not appear as mere celestial beings, but as manifestations of the Creator's wrath and mercy, beings of immense power and unshakable purpose. The air around them cracked with divine energy, and the earth below groaned, feeling the coming storm of judgment. The Watchers, who had once stood in divine council, now cowered beneath the gaze of those they had once served. Shemihaza, their leader, stood at the forefront, his once proud form now a shadow of its former self. His eyes, which had once burned with the intensity of rebellion, now flickered with fear and regret, though his pride refused to fully surrender. His brethren, those who had once walked among the stars and gazed upon creation, now found themselves in the presence of the very beings who had watched over them, silent witnesses to their downfall. As the archangels descended, the ground beneath the Watchers' feet cracked, and a deep, resounding silence enveloped them. It was a silence that spoke not of peace, but of finality. Michael's sword, burning with truth, was raised high, and the celestial chains woven from light and dark, forged in the heart of creation itself, snaked through the air toward the fallen angels. The chains were not of mere metal but of divine power, impossible to break, impossible to defy. They wrapped around the Watchers, binding them in a grip that was not just physical but spiritual, chaining their essence to a place between worlds. Shemihaza struggled, but the chains only tightened, their touch a cold reminder of the boundaries he had once dared to cross. His cries, muted by the chains of darkness, reverberated across the celestial expanse. But there would be no mercy, no reprieve. The Watchers had crossed the line, and the price of their transgression was now exacted. There was no escape from the divine judgment that had been set in motion. The archangels stood in solemn silence as the Watchers were dragged into the prison of eternal darkness, their forms vanishing into the void between realms. This was a place outside of time, a place where they could not touch the world they had once influenced, a place where they would remain until the final reckoning. Their powers, once so vast, were now useless, their voices silenced by the eternal chains that bound them. The earth would no longer suffer under their influence, their twisted knowledge, or their defilement of creation. The floodwaters, which had begun to stir in the heavens, seemed to pause in this moment, as if the earth itself was taking a deep, final breath. The Watchers had been bound, their reign of corruption ended, and as their forms disappeared into the abyss, the world, at last, began to heal. But the cost of their actions would echo through the ages, for the earth would soon face the flood, a cleansing that would erase all remnants of their twisted creation. The Watchers were silenced, but the consequences of their rebellion were far from over. The giants, once powerful and untouchable, stood in a world that had suddenly grown too small for them. The absence of their fathers, the Watchers, was felt deeply. Their towering figures, once filled with the strength of celestial purpose, now seemed diminished, like trees stripped of their roots. The absence of their divine guides left them adrift, no longer sure of their place, in a world they had once ruled with unchallenged power. The connection that had given them purpose, an unnatural bond between the heavens and the earth, was severed, leaving a void too vast for them to ignore. At first, the giants did not know what to make of the silence. It came with a creeping weight, an unease that festered beneath their skin. The might that had been their birthright now seemed fragile, vulnerable, as if it could be shattered by the very winds they had once commanded. Panic spread like wildfire through their ranks. They had lived with the belief that they were invincible, beings of an ancient and untouchable heritage. But now, the truth settled in. There was no escape from the divine justice that had come to claim them. A few of the giants, their minds still clouded by arrogance, refused to acknowledge the inevitability of their fate. They bellowed in defiance, their rage growing with every passing moment. They had been children of the Watchers, born from their union with humanity. And yet, in the silence that followed their father's binding, they realized how far they had fallen. Without their celestial guidance, they were nothing more than monstrous beings in a world that no longer had a place for them. They could no longer deny that they were an aberration, a corruption of the natural order. Others, gripped by despair, wandered aimlessly, searching for some form of redemption. They had felt the pull of the divine once, and in the absence of their fathers, they yearned for a return to something purer, something sacred. They began to reflect on their actions, the destruction, the violence, the devastation they had wrought. Could it be that there was a way to undo the damage they had caused? Or was it too late for them? They sought solace in the hopes of reconciliation, but deep down, they understood that redemption was a luxury they could no longer afford. Yet, for some, the fear of annihilation gave rise to something darker, a desire for battle. They rallied together, their immense forms towering over the earth, determined to fight to the last. Their weapons, once wielded with pride and cruelty, were now their only means of survival. The giants prepared for the end, not with the resignation of the defeated, but with the fury of those who refused to yield. They would go down fighting, even if they were no longer sure what they were fighting for. In the growing chaos, it became clear, whether through defiance, desperation, or the faintest glimmer of hope, the giants would not go quietly. Their fate, sealed by divine judgment, was now tied to the judgment of the world. The flood was coming, and with it, the final cleansing. Their place in creation had been undone, but they still clung to a thread of existence, determined to fight for what little remained. The earth trembled as the giants, fueled by a desperation born from the unraveling of their existence, gathered their forces. Standing tall, their monstrous forms towered like living mountains, brimming with rage and fear. In the distance, the archangels descended from the heavens, their ethereal forms gleaming with divine radiance. They were led by Michael, the warrior archangel, whose mere presence seemed to make the very air crackle with divine power. Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel stood at his side, their strength a unified force of celestial might, each prepared to fulfill their sacred task. The giants, aware of the approaching judgment, made their stand in the wide-open plains, hoping to hold their ground against the oncoming storm. They were no strangers to power. They had once walked with the Watchers, imbued with knowledge and abilities that gave them an unnatural edge. Their heritage, part divine and part earthly, gave them gifts no mere human could hope to possess. They could control the winds, shape the earth, and call down fire from the heavens themselves. But in this moment, they felt the weight of their mixed nature caught between two worlds, torn from their celestial origins but bound to the earth they had corrupted. The battle began not with the sound of trumpets or the clash of weapons, but with a quiet, heavy tension in the air, as if the very fabric of reality was holding its breath. Michael stepped forward, his sword drawn, blazing with an intensity that could cut through the very soul. He did not speak, for no words were needed. The giants, who had long defied the natural order, had no place to hide from the divine reckoning. With a mighty swing of his sword, Michael struck the earth, sending shock waves through the land. The giants retaliated, their immense strength driving massive fists into the ground, sending boulders flying like leaves in a storm. Yet their raw power, vast though it was, did little against the celestial force that swept through them. Gabriel's voice rang out, like the sound of thunder across the heavens, as he issued a decree of judgment. He stood firm, his wings unfurled in a display of divine splendor. For every blow the giants struck, the archangels responded with celestial might, their weapons cutting through the air, each strike a blow against the giants' distorted existence. The giants, though formidable in their own right, were unprepared for the overwhelming power of the divine. Gabriel, with the voice of truth, sent forth a wave of light that knocked back the largest of the giants, disorienting them with its sheer brilliance. As the battle raged on, Raphael's healing touch sought to restore balance to the earth itself, mending the wounds left by the giants' corrupting touch. The giants, no longer sure if they fought to survive or to resist, began to falter. Their mixed heritage, a blessing once, now only served as a reminder of their fractured nature. The divine might of the archangels proved too much for them. There was no escaping the inevitable reckoning. The giants' resistance crumbled, not out of defeat alone, but out of the understanding that their existence had been a violation of the natural order. They had hoped for redemption, yet in the face of heaven's wrath, all that remained was the undeniable truth of their fate. The archangel's divine fury had quelled the storm of their rebellion, leaving only silence in its wake. The flood was drawing near, and with it, the final judgment. The ground beneath the giants' feet seemed to tremble with their every movement as the rebellion against heaven's judgment reached its final, desperate peak. In the shadow of the archangel's overwhelming presence, not all the giants were willing to accept their fate. Some, their hearts still burning with defiance, rallied together, determined to resist the divine forces that sought to erase their kind from the earth. Their anger was a fire that would not be easily extinguished, and they refused to let their existence fade into the abyss without a fight. The plan was simple, yet born of desperation. Some giants, seeing the overwhelming force of the archangels, chose to flee to the highest mountains, believing that the distant peaks might shield them from the divine wrath. They sought refuge in the hidden places of the world, hoping that the rocky fastnesses would protect them from the coming flood. Others, ever more defiant, gathered to face the celestial warriors in one final stand. They would not go quietly into the night. They would confront the archangels with all the fury they could muster. A few of the giants, gifted with the strange hybrid abilities passed down from their celestial fathers, sought to hide their presence, cloaking themselves in the shadows, hoping to strike at the archangels when they least expected it. They moved like predators in the dark, relying on the earth's natural force to conceal them, ready to unleash their power when the time was right. But their plan was doomed from the start. The divine gaze of the archangels was all-seeing, and no corner of the earth could remain hidden from it for long. As the giants prepared for their uprising, their bodies seemed to grow heavier, their strength fading as the weight of the divine judgment bore down upon them. The very essence of their being, unnatural blending of heaven and earth, began to unravel. It was as though the universe itself was conspiring against them, each force of nature turning against the giants, erasing the benefits of their celestial inheritance. The earth no longer obeyed their will. The winds no longer carried their commands, and the very mountains they sought to flee to seemed to mock their arrogance. The power they once took for granted had become their undoing. Each step they took forward felt like an eternity, the resistance of their limbs growing weaker, as though the earth itself was rebelling against their presence. The fight that had once seemed so certain of victory now felt like a lost cause, an effort doomed to fail before it even began. Even as some giants fought on with rage, it became clear there was no escape from what was coming. The judgment was inevitable, the flood a rising tide they could not fight. In the end, their resistance only accelerated their demise. Their last stand, mocked by anger and desperation, became the final confirmation of their fate. They would not stand against heaven. The flood was drawing near, and their time had run out. The moment of reckoning had come, and the giants' once formidable forms began to crumble under the weight of divine justice. Where their mighty limbs had once moved with earth-shaking force, now there was only a slow dissolution. Their bodies, forged from the unnatural union of heaven and earth, could no longer sustain the burden of their existence. What had once been creatures of tremendous strength and stature now appeared as shadows of their former selves, their massive frames beginning to break apart and dissolve into the earth they had once dominated. The giants who had fought with such fury and arrogance now found their strength slipping through their fingers, their very essence unraveling as though the fabric of creation itself rejected their existence. The unnatural forces that had shaped them, the forbidden knowledge, the celestial blood, and the human essence had created an imbalance in the natural order. The very laws of nature began to reclaim what the giants had taken from it, and with each passing moment, their forms disintegrated into the ground. Earth and sky seemed to conspire together to undo the creatures that had so twisted creation. Some of the giants, those who had been born with a deeper sense of foreboding, sensed the inevitability of their destruction and chose to retreat, fleeing to places beyond the reach of heaven's judgment. They sought refuge in the hidden corners of the world, where the divine light could not reach. But even there, in the shadowed recesses of the earth, they could not escape the truth they were no longer part of the natural order. Their existence had been a violation, and no sanctuary could protect them from the cosmic reckoning that was at hand. Others, those who had once stood tall and proud, now trembled in the face of the inevitable. With the fall of their fathers and the collapse of their powers, they waited for the end. They no longer had the strength to resist or the will to fight. They simply endured, standing in the ruins of their once mighty empire, awaiting the final dissolution of their existence. For them, the end was not a violent clash or a fierce battle. It was a quiet, inexorable fading, like the last echo of a forgotten storm. In the silence that followed their disintegration, the world seemed to exhale, as though it too had felt the weight of the giants passing. The earth was slowly healing, reclaiming what had been taken from it, returning to a natural state untouched by the disturbance the giants had caused. The giants were gone, their bodies scattered, their spirits washed away into the very elements from which they had been born. The damage they had wrought could not be undone, but the world had begun to breathe again, and in their place, the earth held only the faintest remnants of a time that had now passed, a time when the giants had walked the land and shaped its fate. The waters came swiftly, as though the earth itself had been waiting for this moment, holding its breath in anticipation. The firmament, once a firm boundary between the heavens and the earth, began to tremble. The first drops fell quietly, almost tenderly, but soon the sky opened, and the floodgates of heaven were released. The waters swelled, rising with an unrelenting force, consuming everything in their path. The mountains, which had stood as the great sentinels of the world, were swallowed whole by the rising tide. Earth, once lush and vibrant, now lay beneath an overwhelming expanse of water, as if nature itself had reclaimed its place. The flood was not merely an event, it was the cleansing of an entire world. It was as if the earth had decided to wash away the stains of corruption, to purge itself of the giants and their twisted creations. The floodwaters surged, relentless and implacable, sweeping away all that had been touched by the hands of the fallen. The giants' broken bodies dissolved into the depths, their spirits dissipating into the abyss, their presence erased from creation. In the face of the deluge, there was no distinction. Everything was claimed by the waters, no matter how mighty or how fragile. Amid this cataclysm, Noah and his family entered the ark, the last sanctuary against the consuming tide. They moved in quiet reverence, knowing the weight of what was happening. The ark, built with divine guidance, stood as a beacon of preservation in the face of certain destruction. Inside its walls, the last of humanity waited for the world to begin anew. The sounds of the outside world, the roar of the waves, the cries of creatures swept away were silenced as they sealed the door behind them. The finality of the moment was heavy with understanding. The old world was gone. What lay ahead would be a rebirth, a chance for creation to start afresh. The flood was both a judgment and a restoration. It was a judgment on the giants and the fallen angels who had corrupted the earth, but it was also the return of divine order. The waters came not in wrath alone, but as a necessary step in the grand design. The flood would cleanse the earth of its dissonance, its brokenness, and allow for a new chapter to unfold. It was not the end of the world, but the end of an Aegean age where chaos had reigned, where the boundaries between heaven and earth had been crossed. Now, the floodwaters were the great equalizer, wiping away all that had been corrupted. As the ark floated upon the vast expanse, Noah and his family could only wait. They had been chosen to carry the flame of humanity, to begin again once the waters receded. The world outside was in turmoil, but inside the ark, there was a strange quietude. It was the silence of something lost, and something waiting to be found. The flood was the final act of divine judgment, but it was also the first step in the restoration of the natural order. The ark carried the seeds of the new world, a world where humanity could begin again, this time under the watchful gaze of heaven, with the old corruption washed away. Inside the ark, the air was thick with a stillness that seemed to echo the weight of what had transpired. Noah and his family, together with the creatures they had gathered, sat in quiet reverence. The ark, a floating vessel of salvation, rocked gently as the floodwaters churned violently outside. Through the small windows, they could see the world outside rapidly disappearing beneath the waves. The land, once fertile and full of life, was now a vast, unrecognizable sea. The flood had swallowed everything: mountains and valleys, forests and fields. It was as if the world had been undone, washed clean in the divine judgment that had been foretold. The giants, who once towered over the earth with their monstrous size and strength, had now been reduced to nothing. Their broken bodies dissolved into the depths, their once proud forms unmade by the waters. Their great cities, the evidence of their hubris and defiance of the natural order, sank into oblivion. No longer would the earth tremble beneath their footsteps or feel the sting of their violence. The flood had brought an end to their reign. Outside, the roar of the storm seemed like a chorus of nature's wrath, as if creation itself had cried out in its final act of justice. Noah, though safe inside the ark, could not escape the gravity of the situation. He felt the weight of what had been lost: the world that had existed before, the lives that had been taken, the creatures that had perished in the flood. Yet, there was also a quiet understanding within him. He had been chosen for a purpose, to preserve what mattered most: life, purity, and the hope for renewal. The ark was not just a shelter, but a vessel of potential, carrying the seeds of the new world that would rise from the waters once the storm had passed. As the rain fell in torrents, the ark drifted on the swelling sea, the great divide between the old world and the new. The flood was not only a cleansing but a rebirth. It was heaven's way of resetting creation, purging the earth of the corruption brought by the giants and the watchers. The judgment was harsh, but necessary. The old order had been destroyed, and the world was now waiting for the new. Inside the ark, Noah and his family gathered in prayer, offering thanks for their survival, though their hearts were heavy with sorrow for the destruction they had witnessed. The silence between the prayers spoke volumes. There was no joy in survival when the world outside was being undone. But in the depths of the ark, They also knew that they were the stewards of the new creation, the ones who would carry forward the remnants of the old world and begin anew. The ark, in its sheltering calm, was a symbol of hope in the midst of divine wrath. It was a sanctuary of life, standing firm amidst the overwhelming power of the flood, carrying with it the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. The floodwaters raged for 40 days and 40 nights, as if the earth itself had been baptized in an overwhelming deluge. It was a cleansing of unparalleled magnitude. The skies opened, releasing torrents of rain that pummeled the earth, and the great fountains of the deep surged with fury. In the darkness of the storm, no light could break through. Every living thing that had once drawn breath on the land was now claimed by the waters. The giants, whose monstrous forms had once dominated the world, were swept away, their bodies unmade by the relentless tide. The earth, once scarred by their presence, felt a profound shift, as if a great weight had been lifted. Their twisted creations, half-formed beasts and hybrid horrors, sank into the depths, their influence vanishing as though it had never been. With each passing day, the world outside the ark became unrecognizable. What had once been solid ground became a vast, churning sea. Trees, once rooted deep in the earth, were uprooted and carried away. Villages and cities, remnants of a time now lost, were submerged, leaving only memories to be swallowed by the water. The corrupting presence of the giants was gone. Their legacy, built upon violence, arrogance, and unnatural acts, had been washed clean by the flood's unstoppable force. The landscape, once tainted by their experiments with nature and their reckless pursuit of power, was now reclaimed by the waters, as if the earth itself had been reborn. Inside the ark, Noah and his family waited in silence, though their hearts were heavy. The storm outside roared like a wild beast, but inside, the ark was a small island of calm, a fragile sanctuary amidst the chaos. They had seen the destruction with their own eyes, felt the fury of the waters, and understood the gravity of what had occurred. Yet, there was a quiet sense of hope that lingered, for they were witnessing the purification of the world, the final step in a process that would bring the earth back into balance. As the floodwaters continued their relentless rise, the heavens seemed to open, revealing the true purpose behind the storm. It was not merely a punishment, it was a restoration. The flood was an act of divine mercy, a necessary cleansing that would undo the damage wrought by the giants and the watchers. The earth, which had groaned under the weight of corruption, would now begin to heal. The forces of nature that had been disrupted by the giants' meddling would slowly find their rightful place again. The cycle of life, once broken, would begin anew. The flood's relentless torrent would not last forever, but for now, it was a powerful reminder of creation's fragility and resilience. The earth had been cleansed, and in time, it would rise again, untainted by the corruption of the past. What remained would be the seeds of a new world, one that would, in its own time, flourish under the guidance of those who would honor the natural boundaries and divine order. The cleansing waters had done their work, and now the earth would await its rebirth. The floodwaters began to recede, slowly retreating from the world they had consumed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. For 40 days, the world had been drowned in water, and now, as the ark came to rest on the peaks of the mountains, the earth exhaled a long, exhausted sigh. The rain had ceased, the storms quieted, and the vast sea that had covered the land began to fall back into the depths from whence it came. The earth, though scarred by the deluge, now held the promise of renewal. Inside the ark, Noah and his family waited for the right moment. The silence outside was profound, the air thick with anticipation. For all they had witnessed the destruction of the giants. The sweeping away of all that had been the future was uncertain. Their world was gone, and though they had been spared, the weight of the flood's aftermath pressed heavily upon them. What would they return to? What would become of a world that had seen such devastation? In time, Noah and his family emerged from the ark. The door creaked open, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the haze of mist that clung to the earth, stepping onto the soil of a world reborn. They saw the ruins of the old world, a testament to what had been lost. The great forests, the towering mountains, the rivers that once teemed with life, much of it lay in ruin. But the seeds of new life were there. The world was raw, untamed, and fragile. Yet, it was also full of promise, and Noah, with his family, would help guide it into its next chapter. The knowledge they carried from the ark, the wisdom of creation, the records preserved, and the understanding of the natural order was their inheritance. It was their duty to preserve what was good and true, to rebuild what had been broken, and to honor the divine order that had been restored. The echoes of the giants' existence, of their arrogance and violence, lingered in their minds, but it was clear that the world had moved beyond them. The corruption they had wrought was gone, swept away by the waters, but the memory of their tyranny would never fade. The scar of their presence, though erased physically, would remain in the hearts of those who had lived through it. As Noah and his family began to rebuild, they knew that the earth was not the same as it had once been. The flood had been both a judgment and a mercy, a painful yet necessary purification. The giants, once towering over creation, had been humbled by the flood, their legacy washed away. But the earth, once corrupted, was now fertile ground for a new beginning. The world would heal, and life would flourish again, though it would carry with it the lessons of the past, a reminder that creation is fragile, and that the divine order must always be respected. The flood had ended, but the journey of rebuilding had just begun. As Noah and his family emerged into the world that the flood had left behind, they faced the daunting task of rebuilding not only their lives but the very fabric of civilization. The landscape was unrecognizable, vast stretches of earth barren and raw, yet the promise of new life clung to the corners of the world like a tender hope. Together, they began to plant seeds, both literal and metaphorical seeds, that would one day bloom into a new order, one informed by what they had learned, both from the divine and from the remnants of the old world. Within the ark, Noah had preserved not only the essential knowledge needed for survival, but also the sacred wisdom that would guide humanity through its rebuilding. The scrolls, the records of the ancient teachings, the wisdom that the Watchers had once imparted, these were kept safe. And now, in this new world, they would be revisited, but there was a difference. The lessons of the past, though valuable, were tempered by the catastrophic consequences of the giants' arrogance and the Watchers' defiance. The knowledge they had once shared was potent, and in the wrong hands, it had brought ruin. Noah and his family understood that the power contained within those teachings needed to be handled carefully, with humility and reverence for the natural order. As they began to explore the remnants of the world around them, the teachings of the Watchers were not forgotten. The art of metalworking, the knowledge of the stars, the intricate ways of reading the earth, all of these were useful, even necessary for the survival of humanity. But now, they were approached with caution. There was no longer any desire for power's sake. The mistakes of the giants were clear. Their lust for control and dominance had nearly destroyed everything. Now, knowledge was to be used for harmony, not conquest. There was a shift, a transformation in the way the world would move forward. But even as Noah and his family endeavored to rebuild with a spirit of balance, the old struggle remained. The tension between the ancient knowledge and the new approach was inevitable. The temptation to wield the power of the past for more than survival lingered in the hearts of some. The memory of the giants, of their power, their rebellion, their glory, was not so easily forgotten. A part of humanity longed for the strength they had once possessed, and as the teachings of the Watchers were passed down, they occasionally slipped into the old ways. There were whispers, quiet murmurs of defiance, as if some still yearned for the freedom the giants had once enjoyed, free from the constraints of divine order. Yet Noah's family held firm. They were resolute in their understanding that knowledge, like fire, could warm or burn. The struggle to balance the old wisdom with the need for humility, for stewardship of the earth, would not be easy. But they knew that the survival of the world, and the survival of humanity, depended on the lessons learned from the flood, lessons that would guide them, generation by generation. as they carried forward the fragile hope of a new world. Even as Noah's family began to forge a new world, the echoes of the giants' existence reverberated through the fabric of creation. Their forms had dissolved, their bodies returned to the earth, but their spirits lingered faint shadows of what had once been. The giants, though physically gone, left behind a haunting presence in the memories of those who had lived through their reign. The earth itself seemed to remember them, a dark whisper in the winds, a tremor beneath the soil, as if the land had borne witness to a violence that could never be erased. The flood had not only washed away the physical remnants of the giants, but had also purged the corruption they had brought. Yet, their legacy endured. It lived in the teachings they had left behind, the forbidden knowledge they had imparted to humanity. This knowledge, though powerful, was tainted by the very destruction that had followed in the giants' wake. Some, ever curious and ambitious, sought out these ancient teachings. Drawn to the allure of powers long hidden, they unearthed the forgotten scrolls, cracked open the sealed records, desperate to harness the same wisdom the giants had used to shape their dominion over the earth. But with each discovery came a warning, one that resonated from the deep past. The knowledge of the giants was not to be trifled with. It was a double-edged sword, one that could either uplift or undo the world. The danger was clear. The giants had once wielded this knowledge with reckless abandon, twisting it to fulfill their desires for control and power. They had seen themselves as above the natural order, rewriting creation to suit their whims. Those who sought to revive the old ways of the giants, though well-intentioned, began to fall into the same trap. The temptation of forbidden knowledge tugged at their hearts, whispering of a power that transcended the ordinary limits of humanity. The risk of corruption still lingered, lurking in the shadows of every scroll, in every spell, in every dark teaching of the past. Yet, there were those who remembered the lessons of the flood, the bitter cost of the giants' rebellion. They knew that the knowledge was not inherently evil, but that it required a deep respect for the boundaries set by the Creator. Humanity was at a crossroads, facing the choice of whether to repeat the mistakes of the past or to rise above them. The legacy of the giants was one of both destruction and wisdom, a legacy that would shape the future of mankind. Their story was a warning, a reminder that with great power came an even greater responsibility, and that knowledge, when abused, could bring ruin not only to those who wielded it, but to the very world around them. In the quiet realms beyond the boundaries of time, the Watchers, bound and imprisoned in chains of darkness, began to reflect on the consequences of their actions. The eternal silence that enveloped them only served to deepen the regret that gnawed at their once glorious hearts. Fragments of their conversations, whispered in the dark between realms, revealed a growing sense of sorrow among some, and yet a stubborn defiance in others. The weight of their rebellion, the knowledge of the destruction they had brought upon both humanity and creation itself, pressed heavily on them. Among the Watchers, there were those who could no longer deny the harm they had caused. They spoke in hushed tones of the lives they had shattered, the beauty of the world they had corrupted, and the irreversible damage their actions had done to the delicate balance of creation. These fallen angels, humbled by the sight of the ruin they had caused, longed for redemption. They spoke of the possibility of atonement, wishing for a chance to undo the devastation their choices had set into motion. They confessed to one another the deep remorse that now filled their hearts, yet they knew that no plea for mercy would ever reach the ears of heaven. They had crossed the line, no longer merely disobedient, but betrayers of the very laws that had governed the universe since its inception. But for every Watcher who showed regret, there was another who remained defiant, unwilling to acknowledge the full scope of their wrongs. These Watchers held fast to their pride, convinced that their descent had been justified by the power they had claimed. They had tasted greatness, seen the world through the lens of their own grandeur, and would not relinquish their belief that they were entitled to wield their knowledge and power as they saw fit. To them, their actions were not mistakes, but a bold assertion of their free will. The idea of repentance felt like weakness, an admission of defeat that would forever mark them as lesser beings. Their defiance stood as a barrier to their own redemption, an obstacle they could not see past. The penitence of the Watchers became a central theme in the unfolding story of divine justice. It was a reminder that even in the celestial realms, where beings of immense power once dwelled, there existed a choice between humility and pride, between remorse and defiance. Those who sought forgiveness understood that redemption came not from mere regret, but from a deep understanding of the damage caused, the acknowledgement of their misdeeds, and the willingness to face the consequences of their actions. Yet for the defiant, their pride would be their undoing, as their refusal to repent kept them locked in their prison, bound by chains that would never be undone. In this silent realm, regret and defiance echoed endlessly, a reminder that divine justice was not simply about punishment, but the choices made by those who had once held the power of heaven in their hands. Enoch's journey took him beyond the boundaries of the earthly realm, ascending into heights unknown to mortal beings. His transformation into Metatron, the voice of divine wisdom, marked a profound shift, not only in his essence but in the very fabric of existence itself. Once a humble man who walked the earth in search of truth, Enoch was now tasked with a role that bridged the gap between heaven and earth. His understanding of the divine plan became a cornerstone in the cosmic events unfolding around him, a knowledge too vast for any human mind to fully grasp, yet accessible to him as one who had been chosen. As Metatron, Enoch stood at the threshold of celestial understanding, witnessing the hidden truths of creation. His sight pierced through the veils of time, seeing not just the past and present, but glimpsing the future as well. He saw the endless dance of light and shadow that shaped the universe, the delicate balance between order and chaos that held the world together. The divine plan, once a mystery, was now laid bare before him, and Enoch could see the necessity of both judgment and mercy in the grand scheme of existence. His transformation was not merely spiritual. It was a complete awakening to the deeper purpose of all things, and he was entrusted with the knowledge that would guide the earth through its darkest days. Enoch's role as a mediator between heaven and earth grew ever clearer with each passing moment. He became the voice that carried the will of the divine to humanity, and in turn, he brought the cries of the earth to heaven. It was through him that humanity's prayers for justice were heard, and it was through him that the will of the Almighty was communicated. He became the living bridge between the Creator and creation, speaking with both the language of angels and the language of men, each word heavy with the weight of divine intent. His wisdom was not only a gift but a responsibility, one that weighed on him as he stood between two worlds, trying to reconcile their differences, to bring harmony where there was none. His understanding of the unfolding cosmic events was unparalleled. As the giants rose and fell, as the earth was plunged into chaos and cleansing, Enoch's insight revealed the reasons behind the destruction. He knew that every act of divine judgment had its place in the greater scheme, each event part of a divine rhythm that sought to restore balance. He understood that the flood, the judgment of the giants, and even the binding of the Watchers were all necessary steps to purify the earth and allow creation to begin anew. In the silence of his transformation, as Metatron, Enoch's knowledge became key to understanding the intricate web of fate that tied heaven and earth together. His wisdom would echo across generations, a beacon of divine understanding in a world that had been darkened by the corruption of the giants. And though his human form had faded, his presence remained a voice in the heavens, a guide to the lost, and a reminder of the eternal truth that governs all. The floodwaters had receded, and with it, the world began to exhale, shedding the heavy burden of its past. The giants, once towering over the land in their raw power, had disappeared, their forms dissolved into the earth. Their legacy, marked by both their destructive might and the forbidden knowledge they had imparted, lay scattered across the remnants of a world forever changed. The earth, having endured the cleansing flood, now stood at the threshold of a new age, one that was to be built upon the ashes of the old. In the silence of this new beginning, the knowledge of the Watchers, though not forgotten, was now viewed through a different lens. Once, it had been an awe-inspiring force, the forbidden arts of metalworking, astrology, and warfare. But now it was tempered by the hard lessons of the flood. Humanity had witnessed the dangers of unchecked power and knowledge, seen firsthand how the pursuit of forbidden wisdom had led to chaos and the eventual destruction of the giants. The teachings that had once seemed so enticing now carried with them a heavy cautionary tale. The knowledge was no longer to be wielded recklessly, but rather with humility and responsibility. This new phase in human history marked a turning point in the moral and spiritual growth of mankind. The flood had not only wiped away the giants, but had also served to purify the hearts of those who had survived. Humanity emerged from the ark not just to repopulate the earth, but to rebuild it. Minds and hearts changed, eyes opened to the consequences of their actions. The old ways, driven by greed and the abuse of power, were now viewed with wary suspicion. There was a collective understanding that the future must be different. In the years that followed, the world gradually returned to a more natural order. The earth healed, life began to flourish once more, and the balance of creation was slowly restored. Yet, in the hearts of those who lived through the flood, a deep reverence for the divine plan remained. The lessons of the past, especially those learned through the destruction of the giants, were never forgotten. Humanity moved forward, but it did so with a new awareness and understanding that the forces of creation and destruction were delicate, that the boundaries between the two must not be ignored. As humanity entered this new era, it was clear that the age of the giants had passed. The flood had been both an ending and a beginning, and now, with the old world washed away, a new world emerged. The seeds of moral and spiritual growth were planted in the hearts of the survivors, and though the scars of the past would remain, they no longer defined the future. Instead, it was the wisdom gained from the destruction that would guide the path forward, a path built on the understanding that knowledge, power, and the natural world must be respected, not exploited. The end of the age of giants marked the dawn of a new humanity, one more attuned to the rhythms of creation and the divine order that governed it. In the years that followed the flood, the world took on a new form, and humanity began its slow, cautious rebuilding. Yet beneath the surface of the earth, in the places where shadows stretched long and forgotten, the remnants of the giants, the Nephilim, lay in waiting. Not all were wiped away by the cleansing waters. Some had managed to escape the wrath of heaven's judgment, hiding in the remote corners of the world, their existence concealed from the eyes of mankind. The stories of their destruction faded into myth, their names whispered only in the dark corners of the ancient world. But their power, though dormant, never truly disappeared. The Nephilim, half divine and half human, carried the lingering mark of their fallen angelic heritage. The corruption that had fueled their creation had not been erased by the flood. It had merely been hidden. Their size, their strength, their unnatural abilities, they remained within the earth, locked away, waiting, and with them, the knowledge imparted by the Watchers, the forbidden secrets of the cosmos, stirred in the deep places, like a sleeping giant waiting for the right moment to awaken. As the centuries passed, those few who had survived in secret places began to stir. Their influence, subtle at first, began to seep back into the world. In the isolated pockets where their descendants still lived, the echoes of ancient power hummed in the air. They whispered of the old ways, of the knowledge and strength that had once made them rulers of the earth. Yet their existence, hidden away and intertwined with the natural world, was a threat that few could comprehend. Despite the great flood that had wiped the giants from the face of the earth, the potential return of the Nephilim loomed as a shadow over the new world. It was a reality that no one could entirely ignore, though many sought to forget it. The balance that had been so carefully restored now felt fragile. The people who had survived the flood carried the wisdom of their ancestors, the lessons of divine judgment, of the consequences of unchecked power, but the temptation of the giants' forbidden knowledge was a danger that still lingered. There were those, scattered among the New World's tribes, who spoke of the Nephilim's return as inevitable. They feared that the giants, once again, would rise from the depths and seek to reclaim what had been taken from them. The power of the Nephilim had not been destroyed. It had only been buried, sealed away like a dormant fire, waiting for the right spark to bring it back to life. In this new age, the possibility of the giant's return was not just a fear, it was a question that haunted the hearts of the people who walked in the light of a new world, still healing from the scars left by the giants who had come before. And so, as humanity advanced, rebuilding its civilizations with a cautious hand, the knowledge of the Nephilim remained, a distant echo of a past that threatened to return and unravel the fragile peace that had been forged. The legacy of Enoch endured far beyond his earthly life, sealed in the sacred words he had written and the prophecies he had delivered. As one who had ascended to the highest heavens and returned transformed as Metatron, Enoch's visions spanned the expanse of time, both past and future. He had witnessed the unfolding of creation, the rebellion of the Watchers, the rise of the Nephilim, and the great flood that had washed away the corruption of the old world. But what Enoch had also seen were the days yet to come, when humanity would face new challenges, trials, and tests that would again push the boundaries of divine order. The Book of Enoch, preserved through the ages, was a collection of wisdom and prophecy that held not only the lessons of the flood but the promises of what would come. It was a text that carried the weight of celestial knowledge, offering a glimpse into the divine plan for humanity. In it were detailed accounts of the Watchers' descent, their crimes, the judgment of the giants, and the restoration that followed. But more importantly, it contained visions of the end times, of the final judgment that would come when the world once again fell into corruption. The lessons of the flood were not meant to be forgotten. The destruction of the giants and the cleansing of the earth were not merely past events. They were symbols, warnings of what could happen again if humanity strayed too far from the divine will. Enoch's writings made it clear that the mistakes of the giants could be repeated, that the knowledge and power once misused by the fallen ones could, once again, tempt humanity into destruction. The prophecies within the Book of Enoch were both a guide and a warning, a roadmap for how humanity should live, and the consequences of straying from the path of righteousness. Enoch's role in guiding humanity was solidified not only through his prophecies but through his transformation into Metatron. As a bridge between heaven and earth, he became the ultimate mediator, the voice of divine wisdom that would speak to humanity in its darkest hours. His words, carried through the generations, were meant to keep the flame of truth alive in the hearts of those who would come after him. The Book of Enoch was a testament to his vision that stretched far beyond the flood, beyond the giants, into the future of a world that would forever be marked by the choices made in the days of the Watchers. Through this sacred text, Enoch's guidance remained present, his wisdom a beacon in times of turmoil. The trials humanity would face were inevitable, but through Enoch's prophecies, humanity was given a chance to understand the consequences of its actions and to choose the path of righteousness before the final judgment came. The memory of the giants lingered in the hearts and minds of humanity, a shadow that stretched long after the floodwaters had receded. With the world cleansed and reborn, the survivors stood on the precipice of a new era. Yet the lessons of the past were not so easily erased. The giants' legacy was woven into the fabric of the earth itself, a constant reminder of the destructive potential that came with the misuse of knowledge and power. And so, humanity, now acutely aware of the dangers that lay in such unchecked ambition, began to take stock of its place in the world. In the quiet aftermath of the flood, the survivors gathered in scattered communities to rebuild, but this time, they did so with a new sense of purpose. The wisdom preserved in the Ark, alongside the teachings from Enoch's prophecies, became the foundation upon which the new world would be built. The danger of repeating the same mistakes was a real and present fear, and humanity knew that the knowledge of the Watcher Sensei, a force for destruction, had to be approached with caution. It was not just the old ways that had to be reformed, but a new balance had to be struck. The knowledge the giants had imparted, the secrets of metalworking, astrology, and the arts of creation remained, but it had to be tempered by the understanding of what had come before. A conscious effort began to emerge among the people to safeguard these teachings, to protect them from becoming the seed of future corruption. Spirituality, once overshadowed by the lust for power, was re-emphasized. The gods, or forces of the divine, were once again revered, not as tools to be wielded but as sacred principles that bound the world together. Societies began to turn inward as much as they did outward. Temples and places of worship rose alongside homes and farms, places where people could seek guidance not just for their material needs but for their spiritual survival. Knowledge, now precious and carefully guarded, was only shared with those who had demonstrated wisdom and humility. The old ways of hubris, of bending nature to one's will without regard for the natural order, were slowly cast aside in favor of a gentler way of living. As the generations passed, the scars of the giants' reign faded, but the echoes of their actions reverberated through the stories passed down. The survivors understood that redemption was not guaranteed, but must be earned through conscious choice. Their ancestors had fallen prey to the allure of forbidden knowledge, but this new world, built from the remnants of the old, would learn from their failure. A subtle, yet profound shift began to take place. Humanity's search for redemption was no longer just a hope, but a responsibility, a calling to ensure that the mistakes of the giants never rose again. It was a slow and deliberate effort, but with each passing year, humanity grew closer to reclaiming its balance, to embracing its place within the divine order. The giants' legacy would never be forgotten, but it would not define the world. The future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape. Even though the giants had been erased from the physical world, their spirits lingered in the corners of creation, woven into the very fabric of the earth. The flood had washed away their bodies, their forms dissolving back into the soil and sky. But their essence, that same defiant spark that had once twisted the natural order, was not so easily undone. It lay in wait, subtle and insidious, buried deep in the hearts of those who walked the earth. It whispered through the cracks in the foundations of humanity's new world, a persistent call to those who would listen. The spirits of the giants, bound and imprisoned in realms beyond time and space, exerted an unshakable pull on the weak and the curious. Those who sought power beyond their means, those who dared to tread close to the forbidden knowledge that had once been the giants' gift, found themselves drawn into their invisible grasp. Their whispers were soft at first, like the stirring of a breeze, but they carried with them the weight of ancient temptation. For many, it was not just a hunger for power, but a longing for something greater, something unreachable. The giant spirits stirred those desires once buried deep within humanity's soul, sparking a fear of missing out on the knowledge they had once wielded. The temptation was not limited to a few. As time passed, there were whispers among the people, of new visions and dreams that felt strangely familiar, like echoes from another time. Some, desperate to find a way to control their circumstances, sought out the forgotten arts the giants had once imparted. The power to bend nature to one's will, to manipulate the forces of the heavens, seemed an irresistible lure. The old stories of the giants, of their feats and the wonders they had created, were retold with fascination and awe. To be like them, to possess that boundless strength, was a dream that never truly died. And so, in the darkest corners of the world, some reached beyond the veil, attempting to commune with the spirits of the giants, believing they could tap into the ancient knowledge that had once reshaped the earth. But the struggle was not only external. The giants' spirits, though unable to directly influence the world, cast long shadows over the hearts of the living. Fear, too, was a constant companion. The knowledge of what the giants had done, and what they had tried to become, was never far from the minds of the people. It lingered like a festering wound, a reminder of what happens when ambition, unchecked by divine restraint, goes too far. In every attempt to reach back into the forbidden past, there was a tremor of fear of repeating the same mistakes, of allowing the giants' legacy to rise once more. And yet, that very fear also drove some to risk it all, convinced that if they could control the knowledge, they could keep the darkness at bay. The struggle was unending. As long as the spirits of the giants remained, so too would the pull of their influence and the temptation to embrace their power. The battle for humanity's soul, between the desire for forbidden knowledge and the wisdom to resist it, continued echoing through the ages, a legacy left behind by the giants themselves. In the realms of the divine, the final judgment of the Watchers and their monstrous progeny came to pass in a moment that stretched across eternity. The heavenly courts, vast and unyielding, gathered once again to weigh the sins of those who had defied the natural order. The Watchers stood in silent witness to their fate, their once proud forms now dimmed by the weight of their rebellion. Each of their actions, each violation of the sacred boundaries set by the Creator, was laid bare before the Almighty. It was not out of hatred or malice that they were judged, but out of necessity, for the cosmic balance had been shattered, and order had to be restored. The Watchers, though bound in the deep recesses of the universe, were not untouched by the justice they had long awaited. Their punishment was not one of annihilation, but of binding chains of light, strong as the heavens themselves, sealed their forms in an eternal prison between worlds, unreachable by time or space. Their spirits, unable to influence the world they had once shaped, were left to contemplate their actions in the silence of their confinement. There would be no redemption, no forgiveness, only the weight of their choices to bear for all eternity. As for the giants, their fate was similarly sealed. No longer physical beings, their existence had been erased from the face of the earth, their towering forms dissolved into the elements from which they had sprung. Yet their influence lingered, an echo in the very foundations of creation. Their destruction was not the end, but the closing of a chapter, a reminder of the consequences of hubris, of what happens when the boundaries set by the Creator are cast aside in pursuit of self-made dominion. The giants, though gone from the world, would live on in the stories and memories of those who came after them. Their legacy, a warning whispered through the ages, would never be forgotten. The judgment, though complete, did not restore the world to its former state of innocence. The scars left by the giants' interference ran deep, like fractures in the very bones of creation. Nature, once whole, had been twisted, the balance disrupted. Though the earth would heal, the memory of what had been done and the lessons learned would echo forever. The giants' experiments had altered the very fabric of life, leaving marks that even time could not erase. Humanity, now free from the terror of their reign, could begin to rebuild, but the task would be long and arduous. They had been given a second chance, a world cleansed by the flood. But with it came the weight of knowledge, the awareness of what had transpired. In the end, the cosmic balance was restored. The forces of creation, once again aligned, took their rightful place. But the echoes of the giants' transgressions lingered, a reminder that even the most powerful can fall, and that the boundaries set by the Creator are not to be ignored. The final judgment was not just the closing of a book, but the beginning of a new chapter shaped by the wisdom and the scars of those who came before. As the floodwaters receded and the earth began to dry, a profound silence fell over the land, as if the world itself was catching its breath. The cleansing waters, which had once risen in judgment, now left behind a canvas of renewal. Nature, scarred but unbroken, began its slow and steady healing, as if the very pulse of creation had found its rhythm again. The land, once marred by the giants' experiments, started to regain its natural form. The twisted creatures that had been born from unnatural unions faded from memory, their existence erased as if the earth itself had rejected them. The soil, soaked with the purifying waters, began to yield once more, and the forests, though scarred, began to sprout new life. Ecosystems that had been disrupted for so long began to find their balance again. Where the giants had once tread heavily, crushing villages and disturbing the delicate harmony of nature, life now flourished with a quiet strength. Rivers, once tainted by the blood of the innocent and the pollution of unnatural forces, ran clear again, nourishing the land with life-giving water. The plants, freed from the corruption that had twisted them beyond recognition, began to grow in their rightful patterns, their roots sinking deeply into the healed earth. Animals, once driven away or twisted into unnatural forms, returned to their natural habitats, moving through the land with renewed purpose. The balance that had been lost was now on its way to being restored. The cycles of life and death, growth and decay, beginning again as they were always meant to be. This healing was not only physical. The earth's spiritual health, tainted by the giant's defiance, began to recover as well. The Creator's intentions, once disrupted by the rebellious forces that had sought to remake the world in their image, began to unfold once more in perfect harmony. The flood had been a purification, not just of the earth's surface but of its soul, washing away the distortions that had been introduced. Now, with the giants gone and the unnatural corruption receding, the world could begin to align itself with the divine order once again. In the aftermath of the flood, the world began to take on a new form, a world that echoed the Eden-like harmony of its beginning, untouched by the chaos that had so recently ruled. The land breathed with a renewed vigor, the skies cleared of the shadows that had loomed for so long. This was not a perfect world, for the scars of the past would forever remain, but it was a world beginning again, shaped by the wisdom of the flood and the lessons learned from those who had come before. A new Eden was emerging, one in which humanity, now aware of its place in the grand order of creation, would begin its journey once more, carrying with it the knowledge that the balance of the world must be cherished and protected, never again to be disturbed by the hands of those who would seek to remake it. In the wake of the flood, humanity stood on the precipice of a new era, its destiny shaped by both the ancient knowledge passed down by the Watchers and the lessons learned from their tragic downfall. The teachings of the fallen angels, though steeped in corruption, had ignited a spark in humanity, one that would drive its evolution forward in ways both profound and perilous. The arts of metalworking, astronomy, and agriculture, once bestowed by the Watchers, laid the foundation for a civilization that was both capable of greatness and vulnerable to arrogance. With this knowledge came power, and with power came the potential for further straying from the path of divine order. Yet, despite the temptation to follow in the footsteps of the giants, there was a quiet shift in human consciousness. The flood had purged the earth of its most egregious corruption, and as the survivors stepped into the world anew, they carried with them a deeper understanding of the fragile balance that governed existence. No longer were they blind to the forces at play in the cosmos, nor were they ignorant of the divine boundaries set by their Creator. They had witnessed firsthand the consequences of overstepping those boundaries, and the scars of the past, though fading, served as constant reminders of the dangers that lay in wait. Humanity's evolution, both spiritual and moral, became a slow but deliberate journey toward reconciliation with the natural world. People began to understand their role not as masters of creation, but as stewards of it. They sought wisdom in the knowledge passed down, but tempered it with humility, recognizing that even the greatest of human achievements were insignificant in the face of the divine will. The stories of the giants, the rebellion of the Watchers, and the flood's cleansing waters were told and retold, each generation learning more from the past, and each generation striving to ensure that history would not repeat itself. However, the risk of repeating the past was always present, like a shadow that loomed just beyond the horizon. The knowledge of the Watchers, though now wielded with greater caution, still held the power to corrupt. It was a double-edged sword capable of raising humanity to new heights, but also capable of pulling it back into the abyss from which it had once emerged. As long as that knowledge remained, the temptation to use it recklessly would linger. But alongside it, a new sense of responsibility began to take root in the hearts of those who remembered the flood's lessons. Humanity, now more aware of its place in the cosmos, moved forward cautiously, guided by the wisdom of the past, but also by a newfound reverence for the divine order. They had been given a second chance, and they understood that with this gift came the responsibility to honor it. The evolution of humanity had begun in the shadow of giants, but it would be shaped by the light of understanding, as the struggle to maintain balance in the world continued. The archangels, though bound to the heavenly realms, had not forgotten the world they once watched over. In the wake of the flood, their divine presence was felt, though less tangible, guiding humanity from afar. They watched as the earth healed and as humans struggled to rebuild. But in times of great peril, they would descend again, bringing with them a reminder of the divine order and a force powerful enough to counterbalance the chaos that still threatened to emerge. Their return was always marked by quiet reverence, as though the heavens themselves held their breath in anticipation of their descent. When the archangels arrived, it was not with the thunderous might of their previous judgments, but with a quiet authority that spoke volumes. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel came not to wage war against the forces of darkness, but to offer guidance. They appeared in moments of great trial, when the world teetered on the edge of a precipice, reminding humanity of the importance of balance. Humanity, now steeped in the knowledge of both the Watchers' wisdom and their downfall, walked a fine line. The temptation to misuse the gifts of the ancients still lingered, like a shadow on the horizon. But the archangels stood as a bulwark against that temptation, their interventions a gentle but firm reminder of the consequences of straying too far from the divine path. They watched over the righteous, guiding them when the forces of darkness stirred, preventing the return of the giants' transgressions, which might otherwise have flourished in a world that had already suffered too much. Through their visits, humanity began to understand the delicate balance of power between heaven and earth. The archangels were not distant, unapproachable beings, but rather guides and protectors, invested in the fate of humankind. They taught that while the gift of knowledge could lead to greatness, it also came with a sacred responsibility. The lessons of the past, the fall of the Watchers, and the devastation wrought by the giants served as constant warnings. The archangels knew that humanity would need time to mature, to come to terms with the depths of its own potential for both creation and destruction. In their return, the archangels established a new kind of relationship with Earth, a balance of power between the celestial and the mortal. Humanity was not left to fend for itself, nor was it micromanaged by divine will. Instead, there was a partnership, a mutual respect that allowed humanity to grow, while ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. The archangels, with their boundless wisdom and power, would be there, always watching, always ready to guide humanity through its most perilous trials. Their presence ensured that the earth was not abandoned, but watched over, safeguarded by those who understood the fine line between creation and destruction. In this balance, humanity could move forward, ever mindful of its place in the cosmos. The most dangerous knowledge, the kind that once threatened to unravel the very fabric of creation, was not destroyed in the flood. Instead, it was locked away, buried in the hidden corners of the earth, safeguarded for generations to come. The teachings of the Watchers, the forbidden arts, the dark wisdom they imparted to humanity were not eradicated, for they had taken root deep within the hearts and minds of those who had once embraced them. This knowledge, potent and perilous, lay dormant, waiting to resurface when the world was ready, or when it was unprepared. Those who sought it would find that the path was not easily walked. It was a trail laden with peril, a journey that could lead to great power or utter ruin. The knowledge of the giants, their twisted experiments, and their distorted view of creation was not for the faint-hearted. To access it required more than intellectual curiosity. It demanded a purity of spirit, an understanding of the divine order that most lacked. Those who were spiritually prepared, who had the wisdom to temper such knowledge with humility, could learn from it without succumbing to the same corruption that had doomed the Watchers. But this was not guaranteed. The knowledge was a double-edged sword. It could elevate a person, granting them insight into the deepest mysteries of existence, or it could twist their mind, pulling them into darkness and madness. The temptation to use such power for personal gain, to bend creation to one's will, was ever present. It was easy to be seduced by the promise of control over nature, over life and death itself. But the consequences of such misuse were clear. written into the history of the giants' fall and the catastrophic results of their arrogance. The knowledge, once lost in the wake of the flood, had the potential to resurface, albeit in fragments. Those who stumbled upon it often did so unwittingly, drawn to it by the whispers of the past or the aching emptiness within themselves. In some corners of the earth, scholars, mystics, and those hungry for power sought the hidden teachings, unaware of the price that came with them. Some found brief glimpses of the ancient wisdom, only to be consumed by the darkness that followed. Others learned enough to begin rebuilding, to start anew, and in doing so, preserve the lessons of the past without repeating its errors. Yet, this knowledge could never be fully eradicated. Like a seed buried deep within the soil, it remained, waiting for the right moment to sprout. The gift it offered knowledge of creation, the stars, the elements could heal or harm, depending on the heart that sought it. To bear it was a responsibility too great for many, a burden that few could carry without being broken by it. Only those who understood its weight, who walked with the divine in humility, could hope to wield it without falling into the abyss. The children of the giants, if they still exist, dwell in the shadows, hidden from the world that once trembled at their ancestors' power. They are neither fully human nor fully giant, born of the forbidden union that shattered the natural order. Their bloodline, though diluted with time, still carries the weight of that primordial corruption, an inheritance of both divine and monstrous origins. These descendants, often unaware of the full extent of their heritage, live in secrecy, concealed in the hidden corners of the earth where they have sought refuge from the prying eyes of humanity. Their lives are marked by a struggle they cannot fully comprehend. They inherit not only the strength and size of their forebears, but also the lingering taint of their actions, their ancestors' arrogance, violence, and disregard for divine boundaries. Many of these children grow up torn between two worlds, the world of men, to which they belong by birth, and the legacy of the giants that pulses in their veins. They are not accepted by either, seen as outcasts by humanity, and burdened by the darkness that lingers within them. Yet, despite the temptation of their bloodline, not all the children of the giants fall to the same path. Some, weary of the violence that once coursed through their ancestors' lives, seek to redeem themselves. They hide their true nature, longing to escape the fate that their heritage seems to demand. They struggle, daily, to balance their monstrous instincts with the desire for peace. Others, however, find the darkness irresistible, drawn to the forbidden knowledge and power that their ancestors once wielded. These individuals often slip into the shadows, forgotten by history, but still influencing the events of the world in quiet, unseen ways. Though their numbers may be small, their impact on the world cannot be denied. The legacy of the giants lives on in the hidden recesses of society, influencing the future without ever revealing itself. Their actions, whether consciously or unconsciously, ripple through the tapestry of human history, weaving themselves into the fate of nations and individuals alike. Whether they rise to challenge humanity once more or remain hidden in the forgotten corners of the earth, their existence remains a reminder of the danger inherent in the power they once wielded. Their struggle is one of self-discovery, an endless search for identity in a world that would rather forget their origins. In the quiet recesses of their lives, the children of the giants continue to wrestle with the shadows of their past, shaping the future unknowingly, as the weight of their lineage bears down on them with each passing day. As the centuries pass, the whispers of the past grow faint, but never entirely fade. Deep within the earth, hidden in forgotten tombs and ancient ruins, remnants of the world that once was remain buried, waiting to be uncovered. The discovery of these artifacts, fragments of long-lost texts, strange stones inscribed with symbols unknown to the modern world, and relics of forbidden power sets the stage for a new chapter in humanity's relentless quest for knowledge. Curiosity stirs, and with it, a deep-seated yearning to understand the secrets that the Watchers once imparted to their human companions. At first, these discoveries seem like nothing more than curiosities of an ancient world, lost to time. But as scholars and seekers dive deeper into the study of these artifacts, they begin to unlock the knowledge of the giants, knowledge that had been hidden away to protect humanity from the very temptations that had once doomed the world. Metalworking, astrology, forbidden forms of alchemy, and more. These are the gifts the Watchers had left behind, and now they are within reach once more. The ancient texts speak of powers that were never meant for human handcrafts and arts, that could bend the very fabric of creation, that could unlock secrets of life and death, that could alter the course of the stars themselves. For those who seek these answers, the temptation is immense. The allure of power, of the ability to shape the world according to one's will, is not easily resisted. The first whispers of these long-forgotten secrets spread like wildfire, igniting a fervor among those willing to push the boundaries of morality and divine law. What had once been forbidden, buried, and sealed is now tantalizingly within reach. As humanity delves deeper into the mysteries of the past, the old warnings grow louder in their silence. The knowledge the Watchers gave, though powerful, is also corrupting. Those who wield it without understanding or restraint find themselves ensnared, their minds twisted by the weight of their own desires. The forbidden arts, so long concealed, begin to reawaken, and with them, the risks that had once destroyed the giant civilization loom ever closer. Humanity stands at a precipice. Its hunger for knowledge is insatiable, but in its grasp lies the same danger that nearly unmade the world. Some see the potential for great advancements, a new age of enlightenment powered by this rediscovered knowledge. Others, more cautious, remember the lessons of the past and fear what may come if the darkness once again takes root. The balance between progress and destruction becomes increasingly fragile, and the question looms: can humanity resist the temptation of this forbidden power, or will history repeat itself? Only time will tell, but the shadows of the giants stir once more, and the world stands on the edge of a new reckoning. The cosmos stretches beyond human comprehension, an intricate web of forces and laws that govern everything from the smallest atom to the farthest stars. Beneath the veil of ordinary existence lies a divine order, a balance carefully crafted by the Creator. This structure, though invisible to most, pulses with life and harmony, holding the universe together. It is a system not just of physical laws, but of spiritual ones as well, principles of justice, mercy, and balance, each element playing a vital role in the grand design. When the giants walked the earth, their very existence disturbed this order. Their sheer size, power, and the unnatural fusion of celestial and earthly essence tore at the fabric of creation. The Watchers, by descending and imparting forbidden knowledge, furthered this disruption. They instilled in humanity a desire for knowledge and power that surpassed the limits of divine intention. With their reckless experimentation, they altered the natural world. Hybrid creatures, unnatural ecosystems, and unnatural growth patterns began to emerge. The peace of the natural world gave way to chaos, and humanity, once humble and connected to the divine rhythm of creation, became entangled in its own ambition. In the grand scheme of things, the giants were not simply a physical threat, but a cosmic imbalance, a flaw in the order that held the world together. The damage they caused was not limited to the earth alone. Their actions echoed through the heavens, reverberating in the halls of the divine court. The Creator's response was not merely one of wrath, but of cosmic justice, necessary correction to realign the world with its intended course. The flood, a cleansing force, washed away the remnants of their corruption, not as a punishment alone, but as a restoration. Understanding the cosmic order means recognizing that everything is interconnected. The balance between the physical and spiritual realms is delicate, with each element influencing the others in ways that often go unnoticed. The divine order is not an arbitrary set of rules, but a system designed for harmony. When one part of the system is altered, the effects ripple outward, affecting every other part. The giants were a breach of that harmony, and their downfall was not just inevitable but essential for the survival of creation. As humanity moves forward, It must look to the lessons of the past to understand the importance of maintaining this balance. Knowledge, power, and progress are not inherently evil, but without wisdom and respect for the cosmic laws that govern existence, they can lead to destruction. The challenge ahead is not just to survive, but to understand the place of humanity in the vastness of the cosmosto. Recognize that their actions have consequences, not just in the physical world, but in the spiritual one as well. The flood may have restored the balance temporarily, but the risk of another breach remains ever present. It is only through humility and reverence for the divine order that humanity can hope to navigate the challenges that lie ahead, ensuring that the mistakes of the giants are not repeated. The battle between light and darkness, good and evil, stretches across the ages, an eternal struggle that weaves through the fabric of time. Though the flood brought an end to the reign of the giants, their legacy continued to echo in the hearts of humanity. The divide between the forces of good and the temptations of the fallen, remnants of the ancient past, became increasingly pronounced. Humanity, now aware of the disastrous consequences of unchecked ambition, faces the ever-present risk of repeating history. The consequences of the giants' actions lingered long after their bodies had dissolved into the earth. It was not only the physical destruction they wrought that affected the world, but the deeper scars they left within human nature. The flood may have cleansed the land, but it did little to erase the thirst for power, the hunger for forbidden knowledge, and the desire to transcend the limits set by the Creator. The knowledge imparted by the Watchers, once a gift, had become a curse, lingering in forgotten texts, whispered legends, and ancient artifacts. Some among humanity sought to harness this power, driven by the same impulses that had once led to the giants' downfall. But the world, now more fragile and aware, began to feel the weight of this knowledge. The divide between spiritual enlightenment and destructive knowledge widened with each passing generation. There were those who sought enlightenment, wisdom tempered by humility, understanding that true power lay in harmony with the divine order. Yet, there were others who, undeterred by the lessons of the past, believed that knowledge, no matter the cost, was the ultimate pursuit. This divide, though subtle at times, shaped the future of humanity in profound ways. The struggle was not always a clear one, nor was the line between good and evil easily defined. Many sought to balance the power of knowledge with the wisdom of the Creator, attempting to use what they had learned without succumbing to its darker side. But the giants' influence, woven deep into the fabric of humanity's history, ensured that the temptation of power would never fully be erased. It was a battle fought within the hearts of men and women, a constant tug-of-war between the light of divine guidance and the shadow of forbidden knowledge. As generations passed, the lessons of the past faded, and the threat of repeating the giants' mistakes grew. The question remained: could humanity rise above its past and seek true redemption, or would it continue to chase the elusive dream of ultimate power, tempting fate once again? The great divide between enlightenment and destruction remained, a chasm that humanity must cross with every step they take, knowing that the consequences of their choices would ripple through the ages, for better or for worse. The balance of light and darkness, good and evil, continues to hang in the balance, and the choices of each generation will determine whether humanity will rise or fall. A new guardian emerged from the shadows of history, born not from divine command, but from the desperation of a world still haunted by the legacy of the giants. This individual, chosen not by birthright but by the weight of their own choices, carried the heavy responsibility of preserving the ancient knowledge left behind. A keeper of forbidden wisdom, they were tasked with ensuring that this knowledge once wielded by the Watchers and the giants would never again fall into the wrong hands, that it would not be used to disrupt the natural order as it once had been. The journey of this guardian was not an easy one. It was a path fraught with peril, as they walked the thin line between enlightenment and corruption. The knowledge they sought to protect was as seductive as it was dangerous. With each ancient text they unearthed, each artifact they examined, the temptation to use the power within them grew stronger. The same knowledge that had led the giants to their ruin now lay in their hands, a double-edged sword with the power to create or destroy. And yet, despite the ever-present allure of mastery over creation, this guardian understood that their role was not to wield power but to keep it contained, to protect it from those who would misuse it. Their journey echoed the struggle of humanity itself, a reflection of the eternal battle between wisdom and temptation. Just as humanity had once been drawn to the same knowledge that had corrupted the giants, so too was this guardian pulled toward it. But unlike those who came before, they understood the costs. They saw the scars left on the world, the unraveling of divine order, the suffering caused by the giants' defiance. In their heart, they carried the lessons of the flood, the pain of the past, and the hope of redemption for the future. They had no desire to rule or dominate. Their goal was to safeguard, to preserve, and to protect humanity from itself. As they ventured through the remnants of ancient civilizations, consulting sages and scholars, they also faced growing opposition. There were those who, like the giants of old, sought to unearth the wisdom for their own gain. These forces, both human and otherwise, were a reminder that the battle was never truly won. The knowledge of the past would always be there, waiting to be rediscovered, and with it, the ever-present risk of corruption. Yet, the guardian did not falter. Their journey, though long and fraught with temptation, was one of resilience. They knew the path they walked was not just their own but mirrored the struggle of all humanity, the desire for knowledge tempered by the understanding of its dangers. As they stood watch over the sacred texts, preserving the wisdom that had once led to the fall of the giants, they did not seek to control the past. Instead, they offered a choice: to learn from it, to understand its lessons, and, above all, to ensure that the mistakes of the giants would never be repeated. The air grew heavy with anticipation, as the ancient prophecies of the end times began to resurface, carried on the whispers of seers and mystics. These prophecies, once veiled in mystery, spoke of a reckoning that would come when the world had reached its tipping point, when humanity, having inherited the legacy of the giants, would be faced with its final trial. The giants' influence, though long past, still loomed over the horizon, an echo of their rebellion against divine order. Their legacy, intertwined with the rise of forbidden knowledge and unchecked ambition, now stood as both a warning and a challenge for the future. In the deepest corners of the earth, the echoes of the giants' transgressions continued to reverberate, rippling through the fabric of creation. The spirits of the giants, bound but never fully erased, still haunted the world, stirring fear and desire in those who dared to remember. It was said that their influence would awaken once more, but this time the reckoning would be different. Humanity, now far more advanced in both wisdom and technology, stood at a crossroads. The balance between creation and destruction, between progress and corruption, had never been more fragile. The prophecy spoke of a time when humanity would face its greatest test, a moment when the consequences of the past would come to bear on the present. The giants' influence, though hidden, would once again surface, not as a direct force but as the underlying current of human desire and ambition. Those who sought power, who longed to break the boundaries set by heaven, would be drawn toward the same dangerous knowledge that had once led the giants astray. The temptation would be too great for some, and the cycle of destruction, as foretold, would begin anew. But there was hope, too. The prophecy spoke of a final confrontation, a time when divine justice would once again stand against the will of humanity. In this ultimate battle, the angels, the guardians of heaven's order, would return to guide the righteous, to steer humanity away from the precipice. The reckoning would not be swift or simple. It would unfold across generations, each step a struggle between divine intervention and human will. The giants, though gone, would still play their part, for their legacy was a seed planted deep within the hearts of those who had learned too well from their fall. As the time drew closer, the final confrontation loomed. Would humanity choose to embrace the wisdom that had been preserved, or would they, once again, be seduced by the allure of forbidden power. The scales of justice, delicate and heavy, hung in the balance, and the fate of the world would rest on the choices made in the shadows of the past. The prophecy was clear. The end would come, but how it would unfold was still uncertain. As humanity stood on the threshold of its greatest trial, the earth trembled with an uneasy presence. As the last of the giants emerged from their hidden sanctuaries, where they had long lived in the shadows, these remaining titans, whose once mighty forms had been torn asunder by heaven's judgment, were now but whispers of their former grandeur. Yet their presence was no less formidable. Some sought redemption, yearning to right the wrongs of their ancestors, their hearts weighed down by the burden of their lineage. Others, however, had embraced the darkness of their nature, their eyes burning with the same arrogance that had led their forebears to defy the divine order. For centuries, the world had known peace, an era shaped by the wisdom of those who had survived the flood and the lessons learned from the fall of the giants. Humanity had flourished, rebuilding what had been destroyed and carefully tending to the balance between nature and civilization. But the sudden return of these giants, now scattered across the land, disturbed the fragile harmony that had been painstakingly restored. Their towering figures, once gods among men, now wandered through the world, unsure of their place. They were both relics of the past and harbingers of a future that seemed uncertain, their motivations as varied as the lands they sought to claim. Some giants, humbled by centuries of isolation and regret, approached humanity with a desire to make amends. They sought the path of redemption, hoping to undo the damage their kind had done. Their hearts, once filled with pride, were now heavy with the weight of their sins. But their attempts to integrate into human society were met with suspicion and fear. The memory of their ancestors' destruction was fresh, and no matter how much they longed for forgiveness, the world had not yet healed enough to accept them fully. These giants, though smaller than their forebears, still carried the echoes of their immense power and could not escape the judgments that history had cast upon them. Others among them, however, had not come to repent but to reignite the fires of rebellion. Their hearts were unyielding, their eyes focused on the same ambitions that had brought their predecessors to ruin. These giants sought to reassert their dominance, to reclaim the power they had once wielded over humanity and the earth. In their arrogance, they believed that the world had forgotten the lessons of the past, and they aimed to rewrite the laws of creation in their own image. The appearance of the last giants was humanity's final trial. Would they rise above their fears, extend compassion, and embrace the possibility of redemption? Or would they fall prey to the temptation of power, repeating the mistakes of the past? The balance between the earth, humanity, and the giants hung in the balance, as the future of all creation rested on the choices made in these final moments. The final trial was not just for the giants but for humanity itself, a test of whether the world could truly heal, or if the darkness of the giants' legacy would rise once more to consume it. Humanity stood on the precipice of a new dawn, its journey through the ages having brought it to the final stage of its spiritual and moral evolution. The scars of the giants' reign were still etched into the world's collective memory, but their legacy had been transformed, woven into the very fabric of human understanding. The trials of the past, the flood that cleansed the earth, the destruction and redemption of the giants, all of it had shaped the path humanity now walked. What had once been a fractured world, divided by pride, power, and destruction, was now becoming whole. The knowledge of the giants, once a source of temptation and corruption, had been integrated into the wisdom of the people. The great lessons learned from the fall of the Watchers and their progeny had been passed down through generations, becoming the foundation upon which the future was being built. Humanity no longer saw the forbidden knowledge as a path to power, but as a reminder of the delicate balance that must be maintained between progress and respect for the natural order. Technology, once a tool of domination, was now embraced as a means of healing, of creating harmony, and of understanding the deeper mysteries of existence. As humanity evolved, so too did its understanding of its place in the vast cosmos. The days of fearing the unknown, of seeking to control that which could not be understood, had passed. In their place stood a more enlightened people, aware of their interconnectedness with the earth and the universe beyond. The divine wisdom that had once seemed distant and unattainable now flowed through the hearts and minds of those who sought truth, just as the floodwaters had flowed to cleanse the world. There was no longer a divide between the spiritual and the material. Both realms were seen as part of a greater whole, intertwined in a cosmic dance of creation and transformation. The ascension of humanity was not a physical ascent to some distant heavenly plane, but a transcendence of the old ways of thinking, a rising to a higher understanding of existence. Humanity had learned from the giants' mistakes, had absorbed the lessons of their hubris and their fall, and had chosen a path of humility, balance, and respect. The knowledge of the ancient times, tempered by wisdom, had become the key to unlocking a future in which humanity would no longer be a force of destruction, but a steward of life, a guardian of the earth, and a beacon of hope in the cosmic order. And so, humanity ascended not in the way the giants had once aspired to, by seeking to dominate and remake the world, but by learning to live in harmony with it. In this final evolution, the mistakes of the past were acknowledged, but they no longer defined the future. The true ascension was not of power or might, but of wisdom, understanding, and the shared recognition of humanity's place in the grand, eternal design. The earth, once scarred by the giants' experiments and the chaos they unleashed, had slowly begun its journey back to the pristine state it had once known. The floodwaters that had washed away the old world had not only destroyed the wicked but had also purified the land, creating space for life to flourish again. With the giants' fall and the lessons learned from their dark legacy, the earth was given a second chance to return to its original, divine design. In this renewed world, the balance of nature was restored, and the once disrupted ecosystems began to heal. Forests grew tall and vibrant once more, their roots burrowing deep into the fertile soil, grounding life in the wisdom of the earth itself. Rivers ran clear, their waters singing as they wound through the land, nourishing all who depended on them. The mountains, once scarred by the giants' footsteps, now stood as silent guardians, watching over the world they had once sought to bend to their will. The air itself seemed purer, carrying the scent of new life and the promise of a world untainted by corruption. Humanity, too, had undergone a transformation. With the knowledge of the giants now tempered by wisdom and humility, humans had learned to live in harmony with the world around them. The days of plundering the earth for its resources had passed, replaced by a deeper understanding of stewardship. Cities were built with care, designed to complement nature rather than conquer it. Humans no longer sought dominion over the land, but instead worked with it, nurturing the soil, protecting the animals, and cultivating the forests. It was a new era of cooperation, humanity and nature flourishing side by side as they had been meant to. The vision of Eden, once lost to the corruption of the giants, had been restored. It was not the Eden of old, but a new version, one born from the ashes of the past. A world where the balance between heaven and earth, between the spiritual and the physical, was once again intact. The Garden of Paradise was not simply a place, but a state of being where every living thing, from the smallest insect to the tallest tree, thrived in a delicate dance of interconnection. In this restored Eden, the divine presence was felt not through domination or force, but through harmony. The land was a reflection of heaven's will, each blade of grass, each drop of rain, a testament to the divine order that had been reclaimed. The earth, once broken and corrupted, was now a place of peace, a place where the mistakes of the past were not forgotten, but had given rise to something greater. It was a world where humanity, standing as the stewards of creation, could at last fulfill its true purpose, living in harmony with the divine, with nature, and with each other. In the quiet aftermath of the restoration, a new covenant began to take shape, one forged not in the fiery judgment of the past, but in the wisdom gained from it. The earth, now purified, stood as a testament to the lessons learned through suffering and renewal. Humanity, forever marked by the giant's legacy, had begun to understand the delicate balance between knowledge and humility. The divine, having seen the depths of mankind's potential for both creation and destruction, offered a promise not of perfection, but of redemption. The new covenant was not bound by stone tablets or thunderous proclamations from the heaven. It was a covenant born from the heart, written in the souls of those who had survived and those yet to come. It was a bond between humanity and the divine, one that carried the weight of the past but looked forward with a renewed sense of purpose. The mistakes of the giants, the lessons of the flood, the long journey from corruption to restoration, these were not to be forgotten, but rather woven into the fabric of human consciousness. It was through remembering the past that humanity would find the strength to avoid repeating its errors, yet it was through forgiveness and wisdom that the future would be shaped. This new covenant was a promise of peace, not just for humanity, but for all creation. The divine had watched as humanity struggled under the weight of its own choices, and now, with the earth in balance, a new chapter was written. The promise of prosperity was no longer a distant hope, but a living reality. In the days that followed, the land bore fruit in abundance, and the people who inhabited it learned to cherish the earth as their true home, rather than something to be conquered or exploited. They knew, now more than ever, that they were not the masters of the world, but its caretakers. The divine had given them the tools to rebuild, and with it, the responsibility to nurture. The world that rose from the ashes of the giant's reign was not perfect, but it was whole. It was a world where the divine presence was no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible force felt in every breath, every step, every moment of peace. The covenant was not just a promise of divine protection, but an invitation into a new way of living, one grounded in balance, understanding, and love. It was a call to humanity to move forward, not as conquerors, but as stewards, walking in harmony with creation. And in that harmony, the divine promise was realized not in distant heavens, but here, on earth, where peace and prosperity would reign as long as mankind kept their covenant with the divine. As the final remnants of the giant's influence faded into history, the earth itself seemed to breathe with a renewed rhythm, attuned to the heartbeat of the Creator. The divine presence, once distant and veiled behind clouds of judgment and wrath, now stood fully restored. It was no longer an abstraction or an unreachable ideal, but a palpable force that infused the world with an undeniable sense of peace. The heavens, once darkened by the giant's defiance, now shimmered with a light that welcomed humanity back into the embrace of the divine. Humanity, having endured the weight of both their own mistakes and the scars left by the giants, now walked with eyes open to the truth of their place in the cosmos. They understood their role not as masters of the earth, but as stewards, entrusted with the sacred duty of nurturing the world around them. The divine presence no longer felt like a distant call, but a familiar companion, woven into the fabric of existence. In the trees that swayed with the breeze, in the rivers that flowed with crystal clarity, in the very soil beneath their feet, humanity saw the Creator's hand. It was as though the earth itself had been touched by the divine, and in that touch, everything had been made whole again. The old world, marked by violence, corruption, and the twisted legacy of the giants, was now a memory, though an important one. The lessons of that dark age remained etched in the hearts of those who lived through it, but it was no longer a cycle to be repeated. The giants' fall, their arrogance, and their defiance of divine order had taught humanity the cost of straying from the path of balance. Now, with the divine presence firmly restored, humanity faced a new chapter, one where the horrors of the past would not be forgotten, but the wisdom of the Creator's guidance would chart a new course forward. The influence of the giants, though still a shadow in the distant past, no longer held sway over the earth. Their twisted experiments, their hybrid creatures, and their unnatural pursuits were nothing more than echoes. And yet, humanity, aware of the dangers of their own desires, chose to honor the lessons of their ancestors. They lived with humility, knowing that the divine presence was always close, always watching, not as a judge, but as a guide. They had learned that the greatest gift was not the knowledge of power, but the understanding of restraint, the ability to live in harmony with the natural world, with each other, and with the Creator. In this new era, humanity found itself in a sacred partnership with the earth. The divine presence was no longer distant, but embraced the world fully. The past was remembered, not as a tragedy to dwell upon, but as a foundation on which the future was built. A future where the giants' mistakes were not repeated, but their wisdom tempered by humility guided humanity toward peace and prosperity. The world, once torn by strife and the destructive forces of the giants, now stood at the threshold of an eternal peace. No longer burdened by the looming threat of corruption or the violence of creatures born of unnatural unions, humanity could breathe freely for the first time in generations. The earth itself seemed to sigh in relief, its rhythms restored, its ecosystems flourishing in ways unseen before. The scars of the past remained, but they had become symbols of the strength required to overcome them. Humanity, now united in purpose, recognized the sacredness of the peace they had inherited. The divisions that once fractured their world between nations, tribes, and even between humanity and nature began to heal. There was no longer a hunger for dominance or control, but a shared desire to live in harmony with the divine, with the earth, and with each other. The divine presence, which had once seemed distant and beyond reach, now dwelled openly among them, not as a distant God watching from afar, but as a living, breathing force woven into the fabric of everyday life. In this presence, humanity found its true purpose, a purpose that was not shaped by power or conquest, but by love, peace, and mutual respect. The legacy of the giants, their experiments, their arrogance, and their eventual downfall had not been erased from memory. It lived on as a cautionary tale, etched into the hearts and minds of every generation that followed. The giants' mistakes, their lust for dominion, and their rejection of divine order became a solemn warning, a reminder of the price of straying from the path of harmony. And yet, it was not a story that invoked fear, but one of learning, a story that humanity could look back upon with reverence for the lessons it imparted. The memory of the giants had not become a cycle to repeat, but a foundation from which humanity could build a future grounded in wisdom. In this new age, peace did not feel fragile, but rather eternal, as though the earth itself had been cleansed of the stains that once marred its beauty. The great battle between light and darkness had been fought and won, not by the sword, but through understanding and the restoration of divine order. The earth now belonged to no one and to everyone. It was a shared sanctuary, a living testament to the balance between creation and destruction, power and humility. Humanity stood as stewards, not conquerors, of the world, and this unity, forged in the fires of past suffering, remained unbroken. There would be no more giants, no more corruption, no more darkness to overshadow their way of life. The eternal peace had come, not as a gift, but as a hard-earned victory, one that would last for as long as humanity remained humble, mindful, and forever aware of the lessons the past had taught them. The story of the giants, though long buried beneath the floodwaters of time, was not forgotten. It lingered in the shadows of history, whispered in sacred texts, and passed down through generations in the form of oral tradition. Each retelling, whether through the quiet words of elders or the written passages preserved on ancient scrolls, carried with it a somber reflection on the dangers of power misused. The giants, once titans of unimaginable strength, were no longer viewed solely as enemies, their existence defined by violence and corruption. They had become something more, symbols of human ambition unchecked, of forces beyond comprehension that sought to bend the natural world to their will. In the stories of the giants, humanity saw both a cautionary tale and a mirror, reflecting their own potential for both creation and destruction. The lessons imparted by the giants' rise and fall were woven into the fabric of humanity's moral understanding. The giants' hunger for knowledge, Their pursuit of dominion over both nature and mankind was a path that led only to ruin. But in their wake, the survivors of their legacy found the wisdom to choose a different course. The sacred texts that chronicled their tale were not just records of ancient events, but guides for future generations, teaching the balance between wisdom and power, between knowledge gained and knowledge that should remain hidden. Though the giants were gone, their influence lingered. The knowledge they had imparted to humanity, once deemed forbidden, had become a tool for progress. But this knowledge was not without its dangers, and it was understood that it must be wielded with care. The temptation to repeat the mistakes of the past remained, but now it was tempered by the collective wisdom of humanity's experience. The giants' teachings were no longer a threat to the world. Instead, they were tools for healing, art, and innovation used by those who understood their true purpose. In every corner of the world, the memory of the giants persisted. Some remembered them as terrifying, otherworldly beings, while others recalled them with sorrow, as a tragic chapter in the grand story of creation. But through it all, humanity's relationship with the giants' legacy remained marked by a shared understanding that power, when misused, can unravel the very fabric of existence, but when guided by wisdom, it can lead to profound transformation. The giants' memory lived on, not as a story of destruction, but as one of redemption, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there are lessons to be learned. And it was through these lessons that humanity would shape its future, walking a path of balance, knowing that the mistakes of the giants need not be repeated. The promise, long foretold, had finally been fulfilled. After ages of suffering, betrayal, and cosmic upheaval, divine justice and mercy had woven their final tapestry. The world, once teetering on the brink of annihilation, now stood cleansed and reborn, free from the oppressive shadows of the giants. Their presence, their influence, had been erased from the fabric of creation, leaving behind a world that, though scarred, was poised for renewal. Humanity, scarred by the legacies of its ancient past, found itself at a threshold, poised between the remnants of what had been and the potential of what was to come. The lessons of the giants, their rise, their fall, and the corruption they sowed were woven into the collective consciousness of the people. No longer would they be swayed by the allure of forbidden knowledge or the hunger for power that had once led to their downfall. Instead, a new awareness had settled among them, a deep understanding of the balance that must be maintained between the realms of the divine and the earthly. The world was, in its essence, healed. It had emerged from the darkness like a flower blooming after a storm, its roots deep in the soil of both suffering and wisdom. The scars remained, but they no longer dictated the course of humanity. The echoes of the giants' transgressions had faded into myth and legend, their once mighty forms now but whispers in the winds of time. Those who survived the flood, those who had carried the weight of the past with them, had built something stronger, more resilient, and more attuned to the true rhythm of the universe. A new chapter of creation began, one not shaped by the arrogance of titans, but by the harmony between heaven and earth. The divine had acted in its justice, but it had also acted in mercy, guiding humanity through the storm and granting them a chance to reclaim their place within the cosmic order. There was no turning back to the old ways, no longing to resurrect what had been lost. The world, once broken, now hummed with the promise of a future that balanced knowledge with wisdom, power with compassion, and creation with preservation. The cosmic scales had been restored, and humanity, standing on the edge of this new dawn, saw clearly the path forward. It was one of stewardship, of understanding that the divine and the natural must coexist, that creation was not a gift to be wielded recklessly, but a sacred trust. The mistakes of the past were not forgotten, but they no longer defined the future. A new beginning was at hand, a future where the promise of divine justice and mercy was no longer an abstract ideal, but a living reality that shaped the world and its people. And so, with the giants' legacy now but a distant memory, humanity moved forward into this new world, one full of possibility, responsibility, and most importantly, hope. The cycle of eternity continued its eternal dance, ever turning, never ceasing. Creation, destruction, and restoration, these were the rhythms of existence, the pulse of the universe itself. But now, for the first time in ages, humanity stood with a greater understanding, holding within it the key to navigating the endless cycle with wisdom. Where once their ancestors had faltered, blinded by their pride and the forbidden knowledge of the giants, now there was clarity. The mistakes of the past had forged the present, and the present held the power to shape the future. The giants, in all their might and corruption, had been both a catalyst and a lesson. Their rise and fall, their reckless bending of the natural order, had disrupted the balance of creation. But through their destructive influence, humanity had been tested, tempered like steel in the fires of divine judgment. Now, the role of the giants in the cosmic order was understood. They were not simply the monsters of old, but were also reminders of the fragile thread that connected all things, the divine mandate to preserve the natural world, to respect the boundaries set before them. They were a dark mirror to the choices humanity could still make, a vision of what could unfold if they failed to heed the lessons of the past. Humanity, in its wisdom, now knew that it must not live in fear of this cycle. The rise and fall of civilizations, the ebb and flow of divine judgment, were part of a greater unfolding story. The challenge was no longer to fight against it, but to move within it, guided by divine purpose. The legacy of the giants was not to be erased or forgotten, for their story had shaped the world irrevocably. They were both a warning and a part of the ongoing narrative that humanity now helped to write. The destiny of humanity was shaped not by fate alone, but by the choices made each day, every thought, every action. It was an intricate dance, where the steps were guided by both divine wisdom and the free will bestowed upon them. The path forward was not always clear, nor would it be without its own challenges. Yet, humanity had learned that true power came from understanding their place in the vast web of existence, not seeking dominion, but striving for harmony, balance, and growth. Divine guidance still flowed, though it had taken on a new form. The angels, the messengers of the divine, no longer intervened in such sweeping judgments but whispered wisdom to those who listened. The eternal cycle would continue, and humanity would move through it, ever evolving, ever seeking. The giants, in the end, had played their part, and now it was humanity's turn to walk the path of creation with the knowledge of what came before. The cycle, with all its trials, was still turning, but this time, humanity was ready to navigate it with grace. The end of the story was not marked by a single moment, but by the unfolding of all that had come before. From the primordial dawn of creation, through the rise and fall of the giants, to the cleansing waters of the flood, humanity had walked a long, arduous path. The world, now restored to its original design, bore the marks of that journey, a world tempered by the fires of divine judgment and the wisdom gained from it. The scars left by the giants' legacy were not hidden, nor were they forgotten. They were woven into the very fabric of the earth, reminders of the dangers of power unchecked, of boundaries violated, of the forces that could warp creation if left to run unchecked. Yet, within those scars lay the lessons that had shaped the current age, the lessons of humility, balance, and the sacred responsibility that humanity now carried. The giants, in all their greatness and their ruin, had left a legacy not of terror alone, but of caution. They had been the harbingers of corruption, their prideful disregard for the natural order a warning that had echoed through the ages. The knowledge they imparted, though fraught with peril, had been preserved. It now stood as both a guide and a warning to future generations. Humanity, wiser and more aware of the thin line between creation and destruction, was now entrusted with this knowledge, and not to wield it recklessly, but to learn from it, to understand its power, and to use it only in harmony with divine intent. The path forward was illuminated not by the folly of past mistakes, but by the light of divine wisdom. Humanity, once lost in the shadows of the giants' legacy, now stood in the dawn of a new understanding. The divine had not abandoned them. Rather, It had guided them through the darkest times, teaching them through hardship, through struggle, through moments of transcendence. And now, the light of that wisdom shone brighter than ever before. Humanity's future was not written in the stars, but in the choices they made each day, guided by the wisdom that had been passed down to them from the heavens and from the earth itself. The story of the giants, the flood, and the restoration of the earth had come to an end, but it was not the end of all things. It was merely a new beginning, a chapter that would be written again and again as long as humanity walked the earth. And as they did, the legacy of the giants, both the darkness and the lessons, would continue to echo in their hearts, ever guiding them toward a future of balance, wisdom, and peace. The divine had promised that the cycle of creation, destruction, and restoration would continue, but now humanity had the chance to walk it with eyes wide open, and with the grace to embrace its responsibility as stewards of the earth. The end of one story was simply the beginning of another.